to our presentation, the virtual symposium on ADU, What's in it for you? We're so happy to have you on board today. This symposium represents the culmination of several months of work by a coalition of community organizations that are interested in spreading the word about tandem homes or ADUs. Why? Because ADUs are a good thing for our community. And we think that you should know about it because we want this symposium to communicate to you why it's important to advocate for ADUs. But first, a word about Montclair Gateway to Aging in Place. That's the organization which I am president of. And as you can tell from its name, our focus is on older citizens being able to age in place. We think that we have a unique approach to helping the residents in our community. We were established by older residents, and we are run by older residents. We think that taking the expertise of retirees and putting that expertise to use can best identify the needs of our older residents. So, for example, we want to forge alliances with those people who have a similar point of view to ours. And we want to demonstrate to public policy experts that our needs reflect the needs of all citizens, not just senior issues. We showcase areas that some of the public policy people have overlooked in setting up solutions. For example, in the pandemic, the recent pandemic, a lot of public policy people thought that the way to get the information out about the vaccination process and about prevention was digitally. And of course, that makes sense in a society where you don't have people who might have been born in the early part of the 20th century or the later part of the 20th century and aren't digitally secure. So we started a Gateway to Vaccination campaign. And in the process, we helped a lot of citizens who were over the age of 50 get connected. And in that process, we realized that they had not only a connectivity problem, but a confidence problem. They didn't understand the technology or its benefit to them. So we started another campaign, and we're actually doing technology transference to seniors right now. And we're finding a very interesting thing. They are telling us that by working with their neighbors and feeling the community spirit, the technology is demystified. They're not as afraid of it anymore. And that's a principle that we think is very important to uphold. How does this relate to housing? Because housing is another very big anxiety producer for seniors. It is causing them to have real issues, both with economics and also with safety. Over 60% of the seniors in my town are homeowners, and they're living in homes that were designed in the 20th century, by people who thought your home should be your castle. That means you had to have staircases up to heaven, and you had to have all sorts of extra rooms for your possessions. But when you reach the age that I'm in, you no longer want staircases up to heaven, and you don't need extra possessions. You need something that's safe and that makes it easy for you to afford to live in your community. All our health research has shown that seniors thrive when they are able to stay in their community. And so aging in place is tied up with options in housing that are reasonable to manage and also remaining in the same community. And here's where ADUs come in. They're not only beneficial to seniors, they're beneficial to all homeowners in the life cycle of residence. They can provide homes for your older parents. They can provide homes for the boomerang generation of children who are returning to the nest because their gig economy has no predictability about their being able to afford to stay in a rental. And they're also very important to people who are experiencing disability. So today we have a very, very rich conference to actually help you understand what's in it for you in terms of ADUs. And we hope that at the end of this conference, you will be able to articulate what's in it for you and also for others. And now for some clarification on the definitions of what we're going to be talking about for today. I use the expression tandem house, which some people like. I also use the expression accessory dwelling unit, but some of these things are commonly known as mother-in-law quarters, granny flats, casitas, backyard cottages, and carriage houses. The key is that ADUs are secondary, usually smaller houses on a householder's residential lot. You've probably seen these in your neighborhood, or rather not noticed them. They're already out there. 1.4 million ADUs in our country, but they're designed to be less visible because they are there as a secondary unit. How can ADUs help homeowners? They're guaranteed to help create wealth. How does that happen? Next slide, please. First of all, ADUs can provide income to the homeowner if the ADU can be rented. That's a welcome boom. Also, ADUs can increase the value of the home. Research has shown that ADUs are responsible for a 35% upward bump in home values. They provide family support, as we said. They can provide homes for older parents. They can provide a home office, which was very valuable during the pandemic, and they can allow multi-generational families to stay together, but respecting their independence. And finally, they can provide neighborhood stability. Neighborhood stability comes when the community stays intact, when you know who your neighbors are. It also comes when you have a streetscape that looks like what you've moved into the neighborhood to find. You do not have to build a multi-story building to provide extra housing if you use ADUs. So let's just do some housekeeping now about how the day is going to proceed. We have three major presentations. The first presentation is our keynoter, Eli Spivak, who will be introducing petite, discrete, and affordable homes. Then we'll have a break for about 5 minutes, which will be followed by a video, and I'll introduce that video when we get to it. Then we're going to have a panel presentation, and we're calling that the nuts and bolts of implementing ADUs, and we will have a lively discussion during that process. We'll have another break following after that, and a wrap-up session with how do we do it here. We will be closing with an overview of the Montclair Gateway to Aging in Place Resource Library, and I'll explain to you at that time how we will be able to help you get into the resource library. In addition, we are taking question and answers. We want you to put the questions in the chat. The questions will be seen by the host and the panelists. And during the Q&A, both myself and Harold Simon, who many of you know, will be on screen relaying the questions from the chat to our experts. And now we are lucky to have our keynoter, Eli Spivak, on board. He had a little difficulty getting in, but thank goodness he's here now. Okay. So Eli has been developing affordable housing communities in Oregon for over 20 years. He started as a volunteer construction supervisor for Habitat for Humanity. And in 2006, he launched the Orange Splot, SPLOT, LLC, to build new models of community-oriented, affordable, green housing development. And to make things even more green, Eli biked to work. He was awarded a Loeb Fellowship in Advanced Environmental Studies at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. He was co-founder of the www.accessorydwelling.org, co-founded Portland for Everyone, and is past chair of Portland's Planning and Sustainability Commission, where he still serves. Remember to post questions for Eli in the chat. We're honored to have him here. Welcome, Eli.
Thank you so much, Anne, and for getting this organized and introducing me. I grew up in Washington, D.C. I, as you said, have been in Portland and really appreciate the leadership of older Americans towards making accessory dwelling units available around this country. Really, their leadership comes partly because, as you said, people want to age in place in their own neighborhood that they know and love. And also partly it's because people remember that this is not a new housing type. It's been around for generations. So in some ways, we're just trying to re-legalize something that's been here for a long time. So I'm going to share my screen for a few minutes, but while you're participating in this, feel free to use the chat also to drop in any kind of personal stories or recollections, or maybe you've interacted with an accessory dwelling unit by a different name. Share that so people can sort of see, because although we have this wonky name for it, they've been around for a long time. Many people already know exactly what these things are once we understand the names. So just let me share the screen here. All right, someone give me a thumbs up, Ann, if you can see it. Okay, great. So this is, I'm getting over a little cough here, but we're introducing petite, discreet, and affordable houses for today's smaller households. And it's for seniors and also for young people as well. So some of this stuff Ann already covered beautifully, but I'll hit it again. One of the groups I work with around the country is AARP, and they've really led on this issue in dozens of communities. One thing they know from their membership is that a third of homeowners want to build an ADU, for help or income or companionship. There's just huge demand. However, in many parts of the country, they're illegal. And just to expand the list of names, there's a lot of them out there. I sometimes think of accessory dwelling unit as kind of it's such an awful name because it's like accessory, like a clothing accessory, dwelling like dweeb, and unit, it's the worst name for someone's home. So we have all these other options, but somehow the planners landed on accessory dwelling units. That's what I'm going to use today. But if any of these look familiar, that's exactly the same thing. And just to provide pictures, and a lot of my presentation will be pictures because that's what brings it home. It's either, it can be, attached to the existing house, or it can be detached in the yard. It could be inside the house in the basement, an addition, or on top. But the idea is that it's smaller than the main dwelling. It shares a single family lot with the main dwelling, and it's in some way diminutive, discreet, tucked away. And there's rules in your zoning code to make sure that it actually is discreet. But visually, look at this variety we've got here. The coach house is all over Chicago, Casitas in southwest part of the country. I grew up in Washington, D.C. All the row homes facing the main street originally almost had accessory dwelling units, alley-facing homes in the back where the help lived. And eventually those got taken over by cars. And now a lot of times they're not there anymore. Now DC desperately wishes they had them back. So they're starting to re-legalize them. And in New England, we've got the converted barn, we've got the carriage house, really traditional housing models. In Montclair, I found a few examples. You got a carriage house has been restored, lovely, in the upper left here. On the bottom left, you got a little garage apartment. The bottom right, another little carriage house. In the upper right, that's from another community not too far away. But this housing type is already in your community. And people love them, to be honest. And then some other examples of detached accessory dwelling units. They could be tucked in the woods, a converted garage. I mean, you're providing a house for somebody instead of their vehicle. On a corner lot, you could have the house facing one street and the ADU could face the other street. In the side yards, sometimes in the front yard, Oscars is usually not legal in most zoning codes, but he gets to live in one too. And the backyard ADUs are available also, where you sometimes just like a garage in the backyard, but really it's a small home for someone. And even in row house cities, they're available too. So here's some examples from Philadelphia and Washington, D.C., where the ADU might face the main street or it might face an alley out back. And then just to give you like the wackiest ones you can think of, these are every kind of architectural style. So for those people who really love classic modern homes, or they really love historic traditional homes, you can do an ADU in any version, any vernacular. Sometimes though, they're hard to see. And so here's a couple examples. In the upper left, this is a row house, and you can see a little ADU door in the middle one, allowing access to a basement daylight unit. On the bottom left, this is from Evanston in Illinois, outside of Chicago, where you've got a little backyard ADU there. And on the right side, that's Washington, D.C., a really, I think it's an historic registry home. And the only way you know that's an ADU is there's 2 meters on the front there, and there's a side entrance on the right back that gets you down to the basement unit. Some things ADUs are not. They're not quite like a detached bedroom. We have a few of those in some communities. And in that situation, you've got a legal living place to stay in. Excuse me. You've got a bathroom, maybe a bedroom, but you don't have a kitchen. That's the big differential, because an accessory dwelling unit is completely self-contained. You don't need to go to the main house for maybe for social or hanging out or sharing a meal, but you have everything you need inside the accessory dwelling unit. Also, tiny homes. I love them. I own a couple of them. They're not accessory dwelling units. An accessory dwelling unit is a building, and tiny homes are on wheels. They're not technically buildings. So some communities have legalized them in certain situations, but that's not part of what we're discussing here today. So why would a community want to re-legalize accessory dwelling units? This is a screen capture from Terms of Endearment from the Houston area. One reason is they're just familiar. Like for all the kinds of infill housing that feel threatening sometimes to communities, it's going to change things up. This is one that already exists. And there's a long-standing American tradition. One example from the past, Thomas Jefferson, before building Monticello, built a small little ADU where he and his wife, and they had their first kids. And then they moved into the big house after it was built. And that was actually a common way that homes are built in the United States, early in the settlement period. Also, expanding housing choice. You might have noticed that in some cities, you've got lots of apartment housing, and you've got lots of single-family homes on large lots. And I did a little screening around for homes in Montclair, and there's a lot of really big houses out there. But what if you have a small household you can't afford, don't want to take care of, a 3,000 square foot house, or even a 2,000 square foot house? There's not many choices unless you're in an apartment building, and not everyone wants to live in an apartment building. And then there's this idea of missing middle housing. And this has been launched by my friend Dan Prolick and his partner. And the idea is that historically in the United States, we built all these types of housing. But over the past 50 or so years, we've almost exclusively built single-family homes, detached single-family homes, and mid to high-rise apartment buildings. We built very little of the stuff in the middle. And that means that you don't have those choices I just talked about. And the accessory dwelling units are really there in the left end of the spectrum. It really has the look and feel of a single-family neighborhood, but you've got additional units sprinkled in all over the place. And in a city like Portland, where I live, where we've had ADUs really easy to build for the past decade, we've had some years where we've built more ADUs than there are days in the year, over 300 a year. You can't tell that they're out there because they're spread out across the city, and they're sort of tucked into existing homes, existing lots, and they're not concentrated in any one area. So that's the sort of housing density that's discrete and is more politically acceptable. In Montclair, you've got a zoning which is really typical of a lot of cities, where you've got a lot of the city, the geographic area is 1 and 2 dwelling zones, single-family zoning. And just to show that many cities are alike, I live in the city of Portland. We're kind of known for being progressive in land use. This is our zoning map. Yellow is single-family zoning. We have a huge amount of this kind of zoning in most cities in our country. And that doesn't necessarily come from benign reasons. And I don't know your history of land use, but I'll say in my town, we used to have deed restrictions saying you couldn't live in a neighborhood if you weren't white. And those were made illegal by the courts. And when that happened, single-family zoning was used as a proxy. It was applied to large parts of our city. This is in Vancouver, Washington, same thing. Seattle, same thing. And it was basically used as a way to keep less affluent people out of certain neighborhoods and make them exclusive. Because in order to live in the neighborhood, you have to be able to afford to buy not just a house, but a big lot around it. In some ways, that prevented people who maybe work in social services or as people teaching in schools to live anywhere near their employment, and it made neighborhoods less diverse. And one of the opportunities we have here is to provide a little opening in single family zoning to have a wider range of housing in all neighborhoods. ADUs are just a small part of that, but it's one of the reasons why some cities have explored the idea is just to let neighborhoods be have a little more income diversity. Another reason is the ADUs can adapt over the lifespan. And I work with a lot of people who build them. I built quite a few myself. And people have one idea for what they're going to use it for initially, but they also have 3 or more ideas of what they're going to use it for later on. So for example, maybe someone buys a house and they're thinking they're going to start a family. They think, boy, it'd be nice if mother-in-law lived in the ADU, in this not yet ADU, to help out. So they maybe build an ADU and they might use their equity, or maybe a grandparent has equity. And then they have a multi-generational household. But maybe while they're waiting for someone to live there full time, they might use it as a short-term rental, or maybe over time they move into it and let their teenager move into it. That'd be a dream situation. That usually doesn't happen, but I will say that during COVID, some people use ADUs as like little schools for their children and their friends who are in a pod with them. And then over time, it might be possible to move into the ADU themselves when you don't want to take care of and you don't want to walk up and down the stairs in the main house. And just the opportunity to use it for so many different things is one of the main allures of them, because they do get used for a variety of purposes, and it changes, and that flexibility is something people really crave. So here's one example down the street from me. My friends Bruce and Carolyn, they built this ADU because they knew that they were not going to be able to continue to take care of their house, but they weren't ready to move into it yet. So they rented it to a neighbor down the street with their small child while they were renovating their house. They lived there for a couple of years. They did it for short-term rental for about a year, and then they got kind of tired of what that took to maintain. And then they rented it to another person in the neighborhood, and then they will eventually move it into it themselves. So it's going through multiple stages, and it's such a flexible form of housing. Multi-generational housing is a really strong appeal when folks really want to be near friends or family, but they want to be with a family member, but they do not want to share a kitchen with them. And this gives a way to have it both ways. Here's a friend of mine built this small accessory dwelling unit in his backyard where his mother-in-law lived while they had 3 kids. And she didn't have to be around the kids all the time, but she was available to help out when the parents were off working. Another thing about ADUs is they fit in well. Many cities that allow them have requirements that they in some ways match aesthetically the existing house, maybe the roof pitch or the window orientation or the siding treatment, or at least that they fit in with other general homes in the neighborhood. And then demographics is a huge issue. From 1950 to 2008, the average home size in the US went from 983 square feet to 2,500 square feet. And during that same time range, the average family size went from 3.8 down to 2.6. So the square feet of housing per person has almost quadrupled in 60 years. And from 2008 to now, home size has gone up a little bit more than even that, which means that we're either having a lot of stuff or getting really big ourselves, but it's not good for a lot of reasons. One of them is the climate I'll mention in a minute. But let's just look at this graph of Oregon demographics. And I know this does track nationally, where you start with average share of households by size in 1960. There were 3+ person households, 53% in 1960. 1970, 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010. By 2010, nearly 2/3 of households are 1 or 2 people. And yet the average house size is over 2,500 square feet. A total mismatch between housing production and demand. And ADUs are a way of providing that housing for the 1 and 2 people households that are the most common household size in the country. In many older communities where the homes were built fairly large, there were large families then, the population numbers has been decreasing over the years because the housing never shrinks, but the population does. This is just another stat from AARP, where they've demonstrated, and there's a great exhibit in Washington, D.C., I don't know if it's still running now, with more information on this, just showing how housing stock has not matched the population, where 85% of housing stock is 2+ bedrooms. And the environmental benefits, this is a kind of a wonky graph, but we've studied this, Oregon's Department of Environmental Quality, and found that 80% over the lifespan of a house of the greenhouse gases generated by a house have to do with heating, lighting and plug loads and water use. And those things scale pretty directly to the volume of the house. So there's other contributions also, like materials, the embodied energy in the roofing that has to get replaced eventually. but the vast majority of it is conditioned in the space. So if you decrease the size of a house, you significantly decrease the carbon footprint of the house and the users of the house for a long time. Because they're cheaper to they're cheaper to build, they're cheaper to heat and cool, and also there's less to maintain on a small house. And expense is also a reason people are interested in accessory dwelling, especially in communities where housing prices have gone up like crazy. And this is really kind of interesting because the average accessory dwelling unit rents for about what the same size apartment would rent for, actually a little bit more, if you just look at the median. But almost 20% of ADUs are rented for nothing. And what that means is that someone is making that ADU available to maybe a friend or family member, a loved one. It's kind of a safety net. There's no public subsidy in this at all, but yet people are generous sometimes with their housing, and they make housing available to someone who otherwise would be out there competing on the rental market. So in that way, ADUs provide this sort of like secret benefit that they're housing people who otherwise would be having a hard time finding a place to live. Here's one. There's also nonprofits that have sort of made a niche out of this. So in Santa Cruz, California, the Habitat for Humanity affiliate worked with Cary, Sterling, and their daughter Brenda, where Cary and Sterling lived in the main house, and her daughter was having a hard time getting housing. Her daughter they built an ADU for her daughter on the parents' property. She moved in, and eventually they'll switch places as they get older and need a different housing type. ADUs are also a great niche for small and emerging contractors. I can't tell you how many small general contractors, design firms get started designing these things. And this is a big issue in New England. New York City is a huge issue there. Also Los Angeles, where you've got illegal ADUs. And I'm not a big, I don't have a lot of concern fundamentally with someone illegally doing an ADU, but I do have concerns about life safety. And sometimes if someone has a dwelling or a part of a house that they're renting out, just the fact that there's no legal path for them there's no legal path for them means that they're not going to deal with life safety things like egress windows or smoke detectors. If it's possible to make it legal, then people will check the boxes and they'll make it safe. We had a firefighter who was a city council member in Portland when we were passing some of our rules to allow ADUs, and he kept bringing up that he was so tired of seeing homes that were basically illegal ADUs that were unsafe, and he really wanted us to create a legal path for them to go because he knew that the homeowners who own those apartments would take seriously life safety concerns if they were able to go above board. And the last couple reasons for re-legalizing ADUs, one is that it's politically palatable. It's hard. I serve on the planning commission in Portland. It is hard to get change done. This is one that you can actually get done. And I should say the impact is dispersed. And the last one, which was pivotal in California's decision to require every community to allow ADUs, is that it's the property rights. It's the libertarian argument. Why shouldn't I be allowed? I've got this 5-bedroom house. I don't need it all anymore. Who's to say I can't put a side door on the bottom floor and rent out a small portion of it to someone else? And one thing that I know you guys are on top of, but I'm going to share, is we got to understand who actually builds these things and lives in them. Because ADUs are the only housing type in our country that are not primarily built by professionals. They're built by, not by the Fonz, although he lived in one over top of the garage. They're built by amateur homeowners who oftentimes don't know what they're doing. And these folks are really stopped in their tracks by things that normal developers just deal with on a daily basis. For example, if you have to get a conditional use to get an ADU, that means you're writing a check for $3,000 and hoping the planner will say yes. Professional developers, that's the cost of doing business. If you're a homeowner, you say, well, forget that. I'm not going to go do that. And they're going to send a letter to my neighbors and they're going to wonder what's going to come up. You would never have to do that for an addition to your house or to renovate your kitchen. That stops folks in their tracks. And also education. Homeowners don't usually know the zoning code. You might know it because you're on this call, but oftentimes communities that legalize ADUs, they put a special page on their website just to let people know these are the rules in a way that they wouldn't have to do for a production home builder. Here's one woman who created an ADU for her 92-year-old mom. She bought a property specifically so that there was a spot on the lot to build an ADU because her mom needed support but didn't want to be in a nursing home as she got older. And no way was her mom going to share a kitchen with her again. She built the ADU. Her mom moved in. I visited on an accessory dwelling unit tour we had in Portland a few years ago. And her mom's just loving it up. She got her sofa chair, her TV, and her daughter is in the house next door, shares meals. but they don't have to share a kitchen, and they can visit as much or as little as they want. ADU construction is not easy. So even communities that really make easy rules for ADUs, and I'll just use my city as an example, you've been able to build them by right for decades. There's none of the rules that I think that some communities, like including yours, are considering. You still don't see all that many get built because you have to go through a permit process. You have to manage a general contractor and architect for the first time. They're expensive to build. They're not that efficient in terms of scale. There's financing available, HELOCs and cash, but it's getting better, but it's not fantastic. And not everyone wants to be a landlord. So as I said, there are some people who are willing to lend helping hands. It's good to have someone on the ground who knows this stuff. There'll be a little pet project to educate folks about their options. It's great when communities post rules on their website to share what are the rules to build one of these things. And it's also great to have a little media coverage. I can't tell you how many times I see a community that all the media is about YIMBYs versus NIMBYs, yes in my backyard versus no in my backyard articles. That's not the kind of press you want to see. You want to see press that shares the stories of people who really built them, love them, and live in them. That's the stories that compel folks to make change. And also know that you're not alone in thinking about this. There are 8 states in our country where ADUs have to be allowed in every city. Maybe New York, New Jersey will be next. And there's increasing number of cities that allow 2 ADUs on a property, one inside and one detached. Just sort of like a house with a detached garage, but maybe there's a little basement unit, and maybe the detached garage is not for cars, it's for a person. Every city in California has this. Same thing for Oregon, really. But also, there's several. Fayetteville, Arkansas was the first city to do it on the East Coast. And there's always the concern that if I allow ADUs, the sky's going to fall. It's going to be awful. Every house is going to be construction zone. And as I said before, it's hard enough to do it even when they're allowed. There's no example of a city where they've just taken off gangbusters and people all complain. I haven't heard it yet. Because the challenge is to write a code that responds to local concerns. And this is where you got to do a really good job to make sure you write your code, make it clear and objective. You don't have to go through a conditional process, but make sure things match, make sure they're behind the backyard, make sure that they're not too tall. Those kind of rules are totally fair game. Because you want to have a clear and objective code because that's the only way it'll actually get used. So to make that easy, I helped write this ABCs of ADUs. It's a guide, and it's got 1 page. The good thing about ADU codes is that they're short and sweet. Oftentimes just a page, page and a half. So here's some language here. It addresses all sorts of hot topics like parking, short-term rentals, and I can answer questions about any of these if you want. There's also resources through AARP's national website. I'll skip over this. This is the guide. You can get free copies of this all you want. And then you guys are working on a state initiative as well. They've got some great guidance on code for a state mandate to make sure that every community has this choice. This website, accessorydwellings.org, if you just want to see unvarnished stories from people who build ADUs, that's the main purpose of this site. You can just prowl through there, organized by garage ADUs, attic ADUs, you name it. You can find stories of people who really built them. Also some policy wonks as well. And then remember here is that although we talk about ADUs, it's about the people. It's really about making sure that you have a community where there are places for all sorts of folks to live and be welcome and be neighbors. And that's really my goal. Because unfortunately, the way we built some of our cities, as Ann said at the beginning, the housing is kind of a monocrop, and it kind of steers households to be monocrop too. And we are more diverse than that. So thank you. And I'm here to answer questions, and I'll stop sharing my screen so I can actually see you.
Okay. I love that you finished up with the idea that housing is a monocrop, and we are such a diverse society now with different needs. We have to adjust our housing so that we can meet all the needs. One of the questions we have is interesting. It's from Jacob, and Jacob comments that the population density in Montclair is so much more than it is in Portland. Is this a deal breaker, or is this actually an opportunity?
Oh, it's not a deal breaker. I grew up in Washington, D.C., which had way higher population density than Portland, a row house city, and they had gobs of ADUs, and they were criminalized with the automobile swept in. But I think that there are certain housing types where you just won't be able to do an ADU. So I've done some work in Philadelphia where they've got these 2-story row houses, but there's just really no place to do a basement. There's no really backyard opportunity. And that's okay. There will be some parts of your city where even if you write a good code for accessory dwelling units, there will not physically be a place to put one. And that's fine. The key is that with there are places to slip them in, that you can do so. So San Francisco has lots of ADUs. New York City has gobs of illegal ones, and hopefully they'll figure out how to legalize it. I guess I don't see, if you're in a part of the city where the zoning is for 3+ story buildings, multifamily apartments, then the idea of an ADU doesn't really resonate. It doesn't make sense because you already allow that kind of density. But if you have areas that are single family zoned, then there's usually places, at least on some of the lots, to fit one in.
Is there any evidence that when ADUs are actually allowed, the nature of the community changes from suburban to city or from suburban to more urban?
I don't think so. I think that remember that middle housing spectrum I put up on there, where you've got a range of housing types? ADUs are so clustered towards the low density area. That's not enough to put something over the edge to have a real different feel. I think if you start zoning an area for multifamily, where you're getting like 2-story apartment buildings, then it could start becoming a more walkable neighborhood and maybe support walkable commercial areas a little bit better, main streets. Allowing ADUs doesn't get you far enough to do that, I don't think.
Eli, thanks. That was a great presentation. You mentioned that homeowner households have been shrinking. In your experience, what's the typical size of an ADU, or either that you've done or around the country, and how many people usually occupy it? Because that's a typical fear of people, that they'll build an ADU and 8 people will move into it and they'll have 6 cars, you know?
Typical ADUs range from 400 to 800 square feet. They're capped at 800 square feet where I live. Occasionally, there'll be an exception if you have a 1,000 square foot house footprint in a basement ADU. Maybe they'll have to go to 1,000. Typical number of people living in them. Sorry, almost always.
Why don't you take a break for a minute, because that's great. Okay.
It's almost always 1 or 2 people. That's the answer. I can barely even think of situations where it's more than 2, with no regulations capping it. You don't need the regs. People just don't cram in that much.
All right, here's another question. What happens to the property tax when an ADU is added?
It gets picked up in your property taxes. So every city, sorry. I kept the coughs away while I was mainly presenting, but here they come. Every city has, every jurisdiction has a different property tax system. But it's pretty safe to say that assessors are good at picking up new construction. ADUs are new construction, and they would get picked up on property taxes. If you have a situation where your existing house is grandfathered in under a lower property tax value, which happens in some jurisdictions, then oftentimes that does not ratchet up to market rate. Just the ADU gets picked up. But I think that you said that in Montclair, property taxes don't have that kind of a grandfathering in capacity. So yeah, you'd expect that property taxes, and people who run the economics on building an ADU should definitely take into account, they might get some rental income, but they're also going to pay more property taxes.
But that is a win-win for the community, the local municipal people, because they're actually going to see an advantage in terms of income from property. Yeah.
Certainly. Yeah. And ADUs have to pay system development charges or impact fees, building permits, all the sort of fees that you have to pay for a new house. You pay those for an ADU also. Correct.
Eli, could you speak a little more about that and the clients that you've had? What are the things that a homeowner typically wouldn't know that they'll face when they're going to be building one?
I think that, property tax is a big one. Sometimes people don't even think about that because they're not professional builders. I think the more common thing is just homeowners haven't dealt with permit processes before. And I think that comes as a surprise to actually have to understand zoning is one world and building permits is another world. They lean appropriately on their designer and their builder to understand that stuff. But from a homeowner's perspective, that's oftentimes new stuff. Lending, people understand that pretty well. Usually people who have the resources to do an ADU, they understand if they have the money in their back pocket or if they have access to a home equity line of credit. That that means some people can't build ADUs because it's hard to borrow against the completed value of it, although it is possible. But I think that once people have the financing, the biggest obstacles are usually just permitting and construction.
Can I just ask a follow-up? You mentioned that the typical sizes, the range is 400 to 800 square feet. I've seen a lot of ADU ordinances around the country where the maximum and minimum the maximum size is based on the size of the primary home.
Mm-hmm.
What's the smallest size home that would be realistic to have an ADU, and how big an ADU would they be able to have?
Right. Well, I looked at your draft code, and I can say, in Portland about 10 years ago, we had a rule saying that the maximum size of an ADU was the lesser of 800 square feet or 1/3 the size of the main house. That was our rule. And we found that what that meant in practice is that anyone who had a smaller house was penalized. They couldn't do an ADU because if you had a 1,000 square foot house, you're not going to build a 300 some odd square foot ADU. It's just too much work for too small space. So we changed our rule to say that you had to be the lesser of 75% the main house, or so that made it sure it was smaller than the main house, or 800 square feet, whatever was less. And I think that works a lot better. There's also some communities like in Burlington, Vermont, where they say the ADU can be the larger of 800 square feet or 1/3 the size of the main house. So that way, if you've got a 5,000 square foot house, you can do a 1,200 or more square foot ADU. It's still small in proportion, but so I guess my general sense on it is that it's wise to write a rule so that ADUs, so that you don't, because, okay, here's the other piece of it. There's pressure to demolish small homes, because sometimes you have a house that's like 1,200 square feet or 1,300 square feet, and someone wants to buy that lot, scrape the house off, and build a really big house on the lot. In some communities, that's happening, and people are mad about it. They studied this in Seattle and found out that if you have a house on a lot, like a modest house, 1,500 square feet, if you build an ADU on that lot, it decreases the chance that that house is going to get demoed and rebuilt, because someone's invested in the property in a way that makes it harder to redevelop it. So communities really, there's a good reason, if there's a smaller house on your lot, that's the vulnerable house to being scraped and rebuilt. So if you allow someone to build an ADU alongside of it, 800 square foot ADU for a 1,200 square foot house, let's say, then you've preserved both of them.
So we have somebody who's actually, if you've ever encountered a situation where an ADU might exceed the maximum coverage of a lot. I don't think that's possible, but I'd like to throw the question out.
Do you have building coverage percentages in your zoning? I'm just going to look for a head nod. Yeah, we in our city we have. The answer is no. I mean, we have a cap on this total building coverage for a site, and we have a separate cap for the total building coverage of an accessory structure on the site, which is smaller. So you have to follow those rules. So you can't have that.
All right. One other. Go ahead, Harold. You too.
Given the cost of ADUs, in a small, we have about 40,000, 39,000 residents. We have about 15,000 living units, and about half of them, a little more, are single-family homes. In a community like that, what do you think the uptake of ADUs? If we passed an ordinance tomorrow, would we see 200 ADUs by the end of next year?
No, you wouldn't. I mean, ADUs are.
And it's a common concern because of parking, traffic.
First off, there's a learning curve. Like if you allow them in a place that's never been allowed, it takes there'll be early adopters who are folks willing to go into a project not knowing exactly sure how it's going to end up. There'll be things you have to figure out as a city, like sewer connections, water connections, electrical services, all that kind of stuff. There'll be some figuring it out to do. That'll slow down the uptake. Then, but how many people did you say again in the city? The size of the city?
It's about 39,000.
Okay.
Total.
Yeah, I mean, let's put it this way. Portland has had ADUs on the books, and arguably one of the biggest markets of ADUs in the country. between 2 and 3% of homes have ADUs now, after we've had gangbuster production. So maybe as percentage is a way to think of it. That if you allow them, and I should say Portland's ADU code is way more liberal than what you guys are even thinking about. We have no owner occupancy requirement. We have clear and objective standards for every ADU. We don't require any off-street parking. The ADU can be internal or detached, and you can actually do 2 of them. And I can't think of all the other things. And the size restrictions are what I said earlier, 75% or 800 square feet. With all that, and we've had all that on the books for well over a decade, we don't have very many ADUs, and the ones we have are sprinkled all over the place, so there's no like concentrated impact. So that's I totally understand the concern that the sky's going to fall. They'll be everywhere, but that's where I go back to like who really builds these things. They're not professionals. There's no one in the country who is buying houses, building ADUs and flipping them and selling them and doing them at scale. The only way they're getting built is by one-off decisions by homeowners to build one, and homeowners are just not that good at that stuff. They do it for their home, for their loved one, for their personal preference in their housing choice, but they're not going to like build one and then build 5 for all their neighbors. That's just not the way it goes.
We have a couple of comments as well as a few more questions. One of the comments is that, again, we know that the municipalities set up restrictions. And one comment says there are usually very strict rules in New Jersey around the percentage of a lot that can be covered by a building, as well as strict setback rules. It would be likely very difficult or impossible to obtain a variance to exceed that amount. And then another question that came in, do you see ordinances that allow ADUs to be sold separately from the main house, and what is the impact?
Good questions. On the first one, don't mess with your rules. I mean, all the time, all the code evolution we've had in Portland, we've never changed the building coverage. We've never changed the setbacks for homes. Just figured that the idea of allowing ADUs is to say you can allow ADUs within the existing entitlements of a city. You're not trying to allow someone to build anything bigger, anything taller, any closer to the neighbor, but you're trying to just allow a different use within the volume. So that's my code angle, is to say, don't try and change those rules. The rules are in place for a good reason, I assume, and just make those rules. But if you allow garages, a 2-story garage, on a property somewhere, maybe allow that same building structure to be a home instead. And then the other question is
about the sale of
right, yeah. Usually cities have no role in that. Some cities say that you can't sell the ADU and the house separately. It is legally possible to do that as a 2-unit condominium. I've done it myself. A builder in Austin, Texas has done it a few times. In those cities, you don't ever even, if you want to do a condo, you never even talk to the city. So I guess that'd be a question for Montclair. If you wanted to do if you did a 40-unit apartment building and you wanted to make them into condominiums, would the city have any role in that? I don't know the answer. But the city could certainly insert itself in there and say, no, you can't do it, if that's a concern. Some communities, actually, the city doesn't mind it, because then you have 2 owner-occupied units instead of 1 owner-occupied unit. So for cities where owner occupancy is a big issue, they might actually support that. And the other thing just to mention is condominium associations or homeowner associations. If you have a lot of homes in homeowner associations, there may be rules in that association that prohibit people from functionally doing accessory dwelling units. And that's going to trump your zoning. So even if you allow them by zoning, you may still have some HOA communities where you can't do them in practice.
Right. In our city, we have a fair amount, it's because it's a compact city, we have a fair amount of corporate investors in single family homes. And it seems like that would be a way, not allowing the individual ADU to be sold separately would kind of inoculate against that kind of corporate ownership, especially if it's married to owner occupancy.
Right. If you have owner occupancy on your books, then you've already kept the corporate ownership out, right? Because there's no corporation going to live in one of those things, right? But yeah, I mean, there are some rules that you could use in your books. This happens with short-term rentals also, where if you have some particular issue in concern the community has about how the housing market's evolving, then my pitch is, by all means, establish rules for that. But ideally establish those rules for all kinds of housing, rather than singling out a type of housing where a lot of older Americans really crave it. Like, why would we just single out one particular housing type for special rules? So I have that is frankly my concern with owner occupancy requirement, but I also recognize that in some communities, that's what it takes to get the thing passed. And there's a lot of interest in making sure that they're owner occupied.
Okay. Is there one thing, one message you would like to leave us with, Eli, before we move on to the next section?
I guess I want to appreciate that your community is thinking about doing this and at the state level. I think that there are a lot of communities in the country, especially in New England, that there's really a lot of demand from folks, especially older Americans, to expand this housing choice. And there's also a lot of history and fear of changes to neighborhoods, and they really collide on this issue sometimes. And I think it's really important to have this housing type be re-legalized. So I appreciate, especially in communities where it's hard to do it, which I appreciate, that you're giving it a try. So I hope that you're able to build the relationships you need with your planning commissioners, your city council, and your state legislature to legalize this housing type. And I hope they get to visit one sometime. So thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Eli. It was a pleasure having you. And I just want to assure everyone that we are recording this. There are pearls of wisdom here, and you will be able to watch this discussion as well as the whole symposium in our resource library, and I'll get to that later. All right, we're now getting ready to take a break. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. You've had a lot to think about in the break, but we're going to give you a lot more to think about. I just want to say two things in terms of housekeeping. The booklet that Eli produced for AARP is going to be available in Janice Talley's office. She's the Montclair Director of Planning and Community Development at 205 Claremont Street. So if any of you are local and you really would like to see a copy of Eli's book, there'll be copies there. Also, I wanted to just acknowledge that Bob Russo, a former mayor and current councilman, just logged off and actually thought that he wants everybody to know how much he supports the effort that we're making today. All right, so now we're going to be looking at a very interesting video. It's a short video that was done by Shelterforce. Shelterforce is a magazine that has been around for over 40 years. Harold Simon was the executive director until he retired just recently. And they've just published a 6-part series on ADUs, which is available online. You can check with us later in the resource library, and we'll have a link to the Shelterforce series. We want you to pay attention to this because we think that this really encapsulates what an ADU is in a very entertaining way. Okay, let's go with the video now.
As the nation grapples with the affordable housing crisis, ADUs, or accessory dwelling units, are emerging as one possible solution. You might know ADUs as backyard cottages, mother-in-law units, granny flats, ohanas, pool houses, or by a different name. But did you know these small homes are getting big attention in the affordable housing world? That's because since ADUs are small, they tend to be on the affordable end. And as communities fight over how and where to add badly needed housing, ADUs add rental units unobtrusively into areas long limited to single-family homes. This gentle density can be more acceptable to neighbors who are resistant to multifamily apartment buildings. ADUs are formally defined as self-contained dwellings built either inside of or adjacent to a primary home. They are usually smaller than the main residence and must be outfitted to function independently, meaning ADUs must always have their own exterior entrance as well as full cooking, bathing, and sleeping facilities. Interior ADUs are often carved out of existing space by converting an unused basement or attic or by remodeling a bedroom into a separate living space. They can be built above a garage, or an existing garage space can be turned into an ADU. Property owners can build an entirely new unit if their lot is large enough, which can either be attached to or detached from the primary home. Some detached ADUs are built on-site, while others are partially or wholly factory constructed. ADU owners can choose to rent to non-relatives, creating both a wealth-building opportunity for the homeowner and a much-needed rental unit. ADUs are also appealing to the nearly 60 million U.S. residents who live in multi-generational homes. They allow parents to age with their families, boomerang kids to have their own space, or relatives with special needs to live in partial independence. While ADUs have always been around, the nation's severe shortage of rental units has helped them gain mainstream acceptance. More and more local and even state governments are looking to ADUs as a solution and are changing zoning requirements to allow them. As of 2021, 8 states had enacted legislation encouraging or allowing local lawmakers to permit ADUs. Still, opinions about ADUs' viability as a tool to address the housing crisis and about best practices when structuring policy and financing to get them to scale vary as widely as do the forms ADUs take. Check out Shelterforce's 6-part series to learn more about what advocates and opponents say about them.
Peter, to you.
Okay, we all set?
Well, actually, it gives me a chance to say one more thing. In New Jersey, we have 2 local municipalities that have actually passed ordinances for ADUs, Princeton and Maplewood. And there are 2 state bills that have been proposed. So it is not a conversation that's a total abstract. In our community right now, this is a growing point of interest. So we brought together a group of people who represent some of the key organizations and units that Eli said should be in on the conversation. We have somebody who's a professional planner, somebody from the Montclair Council, a realtor, and an architect. And threading it all together is going to be Peter Keating, who is the moderator. Okay, Peter, now it's over to you.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you to all of our panelists. We have a great panel. I want to thank everyone for their interest and their time and making all this happen on a Friday afternoon and overcoming. We could all do this virtually. We appreciate everybody's participation. I'm going to introduce our panelists briefly, one at a time in alphabetical order. Then we'll give each of them a chance to offer any introductory remarks or information they have. Those are not mandatory, but we'll go around everybody. And then we'll have what I expect will be a fantastic discussion. So let me start with Zoe Baldwin, who is the New Jersey director of the Regional Plan Association. If you don't know what the RPA is, you should. Anybody with an interest in housing, infrastructure, transportation, planning should read their reports. They're an independent nonprofit planning organization that formulates recommendations to improve the quality of life and economic competitiveness of all our communities in the tri-state area. Zoe has long experience in policy and advocacy positions, particularly in the areas of infrastructure, funding, and finance, and as well as construction issues. She is formerly the projects director for Senator Cory Booker and a senior specialist in transportation and environmental issues for Senator Frank Lautenberg. I'll just go along and show you everyone who's going to be participating. Laszlo Kiss is an architect. His firm Studio Kiss is renowned for its emphasis on sustainable and green architecture, and he serves as a strategic consultant for energy efficient buildings. Laszlo has designed residential, retail, and commercial projects throughout the New York metropolitan area, and he has taught architecture, including a School of Design. Robin Seidon is the co-owner and broker associate at West of Hudson Real Estate in West Orange, where she works to simplify the process of buying and selling real estate while building long-lasting relationships with clients. Previously, she was a realtor at Keller Williams. Before that, she produced television programming for many years, including diverse children's shows. And finally, Peter Yacobellis is Township Councilor at Large in Montclair, where I can tell you personally, he has mobilized support for numerous groups of residents, including flooding victims and organizers of Project Oasis and multiple other groups. He has served as an official in the administrations of New York Governors David Paterson and Andrew Cuomo, and is an executive at multiple companies, including American Express. He is also a longtime advocate for LGBTQ rights. Among many roles he has played on that front, he was formerly finance director for Garden State Equality. Welcome, everybody. We'll go once more around the table and see who wants to bring important material to our attention, starting with you, Zoe.
Hi, all right, I'm gonna share my screen here. Just give me 1 minute. Let's see. All right. All right, we got it there. All right. So good afternoon, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. Again, my name is Zoe Baldwin. I'm the New Jersey Director for the Regional Plan Association. We're the nation's oldest metropolitan planning and advocacy organization. We research and analyze the built environment and around the tri-state area specifically, and how it serves and could better serve the people in industry that rely on it every day. We've been at this for a while. Our first regional plan was released we just turned 100. It was released in May 10th, 1922. And our most recent, pictured here, was released in 27 and includes 61 recommendations to address a host of issues across the region. The core values are equity, sustainability, prosperity, and health. Starting not with growth, but with these values, we seek to put a framework around the most fundamental question. What kind of communities do we want to have? How do we make this region more affordable? How do we create communities that enable active, healthy lifestyles? And how do we ensure that all individuals have equal opportunity to live full and productive lives? And lastly, how do you reduce your impact on the environment by designing better communities? And I think you can guess where I'm going here and perhaps which policy option checks off all of these boxes. And you guessed it, it's accessory dwelling units. We can create much needed new housing just by allowing ADUs in communities like Montclair. And I don't want to restate what other people have said, but having these housing options is critical for the entire age range that any community has. Everyone has different space and budgetary needs, and ADUs really fill that kind of missing middle gap that we have. And the need for these housing options isn't just anecdotal, it's actually backed up by all of the statistics. And so I'm not going to bore you with too many charts, but I thought it was necessary to share some of RPA's research on the housing trends that could help contextualize why this is so important, especially now. So these charts compare home appreciation rates over the past decade and then into the pandemic. Above on the top is New York City in red, and below on the bottom is New Jersey in blue, and each line is a county. The dotted vertical line represents the pandemic. And so if you look, New York has had a 50% appreciation rate, but it happened over a decade. Whereas if you look at the bottom, New Jersey had a similar appreciation rate that literally happened in a matter of months. And that's a very different situation. And this is by and large the result of housing scarcity that has been exacerbated by the pandemic. And housing scarcity impacts renters and owners and people of all ages. And I'm sure I don't have to tell anyone in this community that even before the pandemic, New Jersey had a very high housing cost burden. And actually, New Jersey stands out in this category among homeowners. We're the third highest rate in the country, behind only Hawaii and California. And I'm sure I also don't need to tell you that we have a property tax burden as well. It's a huge part of that cost. And actually in Montclair, with that astronomical number you see on your screen there, you're the 11th highest property tax rate in the state. And these conditions affect older adults more than others. And these costs mean that we can't trust the traditional logic that homeownership will shield us from rising housing costs. And the boomers only just started to retire. So for anyone on a fixed income, these cost burdens, coupled with a limited housing stock, can make it especially difficult to age in place or for renters to find somewhere affordable to live. And it's critical that we make every tool possible available to help all residents navigate these overlapping hardships. You know, your older residents have treasured living in Montclair, and enabling ADUs is a really good and simple way to give them the opportunity to continue to do just that. That's why, so I don't want to reiterate what the earlier speaker said, but that's why groups like AARP are so supportive of ADUs. We've been working with them at the state level on, there's actually 3 pieces of legislation introduced at this point, looking to enable ADUs statewide in different ways. And it's pretty impressive that according to AARP's research, over 3/4 of the people over 50 want to age in place, but less than half think they're going to be able to. And we should take that to heart. And these are all very reasonable wants and needs. And living where you love doesn't have to be so hard. And allowing for ADUs is a great tool for anyone looking, for either homeowners or renters. And so this, again, I'm sorry for the little bit of duplication, but this is just like a quick little sketch. This is AARP, just showing like what kind of ADUs you can have out there. And, I just wanted to highlight, again, what these look like. These are normal, unobtrusive units. And by setting rational and attainable design standards, you can ensure that your neighborhoods retain their charm, because Montclair is absolutely charming. And then especially here, this one on the right, I want to highlight, that's actually in my neighborhood down here in Monmouth County. And I live near the shore where there's a ton of ADUs that are grandfathered in, but you can't build new ones. And, I just wanted to highlight, these are all over the place, and you wouldn't notice unless you were actively looking in someone's backyard for the most part. It's also, again, worth noting, these are the 8 states where it is legal and when they've been legal. So this is not a new concept. Hawaii's had it since 1981. RPA was very involved in the Connecticut for statewide legalization in Connecticut. And that was a really good victory. And just as an amusing aside, if Connecticut can do it, we can do it. We can't let them best us. We're New Jersey. And so in addition to zoning issues, there are other hurdles sometimes to getting ADUs built and online. And so I just wanted to share some of the ways that local governments are providing resources to facilitate this process. So as I'm sure you can guess, it can be hard sometimes for homeowners to navigate the finances of building an ADU, even if they are allowed by zoning. And so some places like San Mateo County have provided assistance for homeowners to estimate costs and navigating the process of finding and building or renovating a unit. And so, for example, this calculator will estimate the cost, loan size, taxes, and even projected return on investment. And then LA actually got a little more creative with help for older residents looking for rentals. And this I thought was super interesting. They have an ADU accelerator program that pairs older adults facing housing insecurity with homeowners. And then in return, the homeowners receive benefits such as tenant screening, timely rent, and landlord support. And so sometimes it's not just about the physical construction, it's about supporting and facilitating the mechanisms that we've put in place to make sure that they're effective. And then at the federal level, the White House last year mandated that Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae facilitate the financing of ADUs. And then actually just last week or the week before, the administration announced several other housing policies that will help pave the way. And they're kind of interesting. And so the first one, and they don't have too many details yet, so this was just announced, but they're looking to reward jurisdictions that have done what you're looking at doing right now in Montclair with reformed zoning and land use policies by giving them higher scores in certain federal grant processes. And then additionally, they're exploring avenues right now to help with the financing side of it, particularly for low and moderate income homeowners looking to generate that passive income we mentioned earlier to be able to stay in their homes. And then I'll just close it out with just a few points on why this makes so much sense for Montclair. Beyond the benefits we've already heard about, ADUs check a lot of other boxes, especially in Montclair. And so, look at all these train stations. Enabling ADUs would be able to build off this fantastic base that you guys have. Like, you are such a great infrastructure town. And, that's going to help more people reduce the amount that they have to drive, which cuts pollution from emissions, reduces traffic. It provides more housing for students and young adults at a time when rents are nearly unaffordable. And it also gives extended families the flexibility to stay together without being like two together, if you know what I mean. And all of the reasons that you love your community are all of the reasons that you should be able to stay here and to welcome others. You don't need me to tell you why Montclair is so great. You have such a rich and vibrant town with fantastic schools, and ADUs allow for more housing near these community anchors. And so thanks so much for listening, and again for having me. I know there's a lot of information today, but I wanted to end on a personal note because beyond my job, I'm very passionate about this issue individually. So my husband was raised in an ADU by his single father in Wall Township down here in Monmouth County. And that gave him the opportunity to go to a really good school system that they otherwise would not have been able to afford. And then additionally, my dad, who's 74, has multiple sclerosis, and allowing ADUs will allow my parents to either live independently, but within help's reach in my existing property, for example, or alternatively would allow my parents to remain in their home, but create living arrangements for the inevitable home health care that comes with some of these long-term health issues. And so again, I'm really excited to see a forum like this and to see Montclair really taking this seriously and looking to take it to the next step. And this is such a needed conversation. So thanks again, and I welcome any questions. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me move on to Laszlo. Laszlo, is there anything you'd like to say by way of introduction or opening remarks?
Yes, well, thank you for having me on this panel. If I cough a lot, it's because I'm just recovering from COVID. It's been pretty nasty. I think what I can bring to the discussion, and one aspect that Ellie had sort of outlined, is the difficulty of building them, right? And because of their small scale, it's difficult to get professional help. So there's got a lot of hurdles. And I guess one suggestion that I would make, and maybe something like this could be implemented, is to create a small 2 or 3 pre-approved models, that especially for the freestanding units. I mean, when you're talking about adding on or modifying a unit, that's one thing. But if you're doing freestanding units, maybe there's ways of creating a prefab unit, that is already, it's been designed, maybe some slight modifications. You can always change materials on it, but that could be done in a modular factory. It would simplify the whole process of the design element and of the building element, and reduce the amount of on-site labor, coordination, and things like that. So I guess because of my background in building with modular and prefabrication, I think that that's well suited for this problem.
Excellent, thank you. All right, that's something we're gonna talk about.
The house behind me actually is a modular.
Yes, I think we can talk with you about dispelling some of the misunderstandings and expanding people's awareness about how making things modular can improve housing in general, and this in particular. Let me ask you, Robin, is there anything you want to say by way of introduction or opening statements? I think you might be muted still.
Of course I was. There we go.
There we go.
Just as way of introduction, West of Hudson Real Estate is actually located in Montclair. We're Montclair, Essex County company, but our office is in Montclair. One of the things that I've noticed since I've been a realtor in Montclair is the kind of way that people migrate out of the city. And as you get older, if you see your expenses, increasing and your income decreasing, find that you can't stay in your home. And so we end up being kind of a lopsided community if that continues. And I think that we need to be able to age in place. And I think that one of the things that keeps Montclair so vibrant and keeps it so popular is its diversity in terms of who lives here. And that won't be able to be maintained unless we start addressing some of these housing issues that we have, and allow people to find other ways to stay in their homes. I don't think the apartment buildings that are being built do that. I think they bring in a lot younger people. And I just think I would love to see
Montclair stay substantially the way it was when I moved here. I mean, that's not possible, but at least to keep the flavor of, different generations here.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Peter Yacobellis, is there anything you'd like to say at this stage? Feel free.
Thanks for having me, Peter, and thanks for hosting this. I do want to thank the working group who put together the draft ordinance and has been doing a ton of research and has helped educate me on this issue for over a year now. So starting with my colleagues, Councilwoman Price Abrams, who's been really spearheading this, Councilman Bob Russo, started really with William Scott and others. Former Councilwoman Renee Baskerville was part of the process. And then the current working group, which has been Ann Harold, who are on this, Wendy McNeil, Janice Talley, our township planner, Carmel Lockman from the planning board as well. So everybody has just poured hours and hours and hours into this. We've met, probably 12 times over the last year plus to develop the ordinance to the point where it is. And along that entire time, it's been incredibly educational. I want to thank you for the presentation today. It's been really, really helpful to get additional context and perspective from what we've already had for those of us working in the working group. And I heard some things that I certainly agree with and just want to reinforce in terms of where I'm coming from. I'm not going to speak for my colleagues. I do think it's really important that we take a hard look at how do we incentivize and make it easier for people to age in place in Montclair, being mindful of the fact that people can age in place better if they do have another source of income. The dynamics of family in America is to want to be able to care for each other. So I love the idea of flipping where children can move into the main unit and the parents can move into an accessory unit, or vice versa, or a home health aide. There's just so many ways to think about that in terms of quality of life. It's a downsizing opportunity as well, if you think about it in that context for people, so you don't have to move out of town or move into one of those giant buildings or even move into a senior living facility. And to Robin's point, we do have a hot housing market in Montclair. We're not Vancouver or Seattle, but we have a very hot housing market, and we have a housing shortage, and we have an affordability crisis. And so how do you look at development from a smart perspective that really respects the character and the integrity of the township? And I do think this is one way. I look at ADUs, and this is the opinion that I've formed over the last year plus of being on this education journey with all of you. I look at ADUs as a scalpel approach to development, as a scalpel approach to housing construction and development in the town, right? Really smart, really particular, really intentional about how we're looking at individual lots for adding these possible accessory dwelling units, whether they're, again, attached to the primary structure or detached. And doing so while really protecting and respecting the character of Montclair, the aesthetics of Montclair, and being mindful of things that are top of mind. And you mentioned this, Peter, earlier, stormwater management, infrastructure that others have raised as well. So I'm excited about the conversation. Thank you for having me be a part of it.
Thank you. Thank you for your time. And thank you again, everybody, for participating. Let me see if I can bring forth a few points that I think a few people have mentioned that I think are interesting, go to the heart of what this is all about. Peter just mentioned this as being a scalpel approach. I wonder if it's a scalpel approach, not just to the actual construction of housing units, but to maybe carving out new understandings of how we think about housing in general. I'm really struck by the fact that when we talk about aging in place today, we're not just talking about things that affect the folks who are literally the ones aging in place. 15 years ago, I started a retirement column for Smart Money magazine, which is no longer in business, like so many other places I've worked for. And it was called The New Retirement. What was new about it was that as baby boomers were reaching their peak earning years, their financial planning was no longer just for themselves. It overlapped with how they were planning for college for their kids and for healthcare and retirement for their planning, for their parents. They almost had to do two sets of retirement planning. Well, 15 years later, the situation isn't just the same, it's more acute. Everyone, I'll say, of a certain age, let's say me and older, or 10 younger, planning in triplicate for their kids who are not entering stable job markets, for their parents who are still around and who are facing rising property taxes and rising housing costs on, at best, fixed incomes, right? And who are facing rising healthcare costs, and then our own planning for the future. And I wonder if, I mean, this seems like a whole life cycle issue where an ADU might be useful for your kids, might be useful for your office, it might be useful for your parents at different points in your life. I'm wondering, do you think that, well, what is the lived experience of this? Let me start with you, Zoe. Do ADUs typically get used by one member of a family or one renter for a long stretch of time? Or is it something that families can dip into as they need in different ways over time? Because this seems like a possible tool, and I haven't seen many in a town where prices just keep zooming out of control in many different directions. Is this a tool to help keep families together, different parts of families together over the long haul?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, especially if you look historically, it's actually only in like the relatively comparatively recent past that we stopped kind of living in these extended family situations. My dad grew up with his grandparents in the basement in Carteret. You know what I mean? That was kind of a standard thing, both for you know, taking care of aging relatives. You have built-in childcare. A lot of times when you have those generational households, and as someone mentioned earlier, you can kind of switch, and that's what's kind of nice, because one of the key things that we need to keep in mind for people when we talk about housing for any age is it's not one size fits all. Not everyone needs a single family house. Not everyone needs a large single family house. And this kind of makes sure that there's options. In so many policy areas, you hear about the missing middle, and ADUs really do fill a gap that we absolutely need filled right now.
Robin, are you finding that to be true in what people talk about when they come looking for housing? Is it just gazillionaires flooding out from the city with money who want to buy at the top of the market because the market is so hot? Or do you hear people saying, I need to think about my kids, or I need to think about my parents, I need to be flexible in this way? Is this anything that people are bringing up?
I mean, what I have found, they don't necessarily come to Montclair looking to, that sort of thing. I think most of our buyers here are the more affluent, but what the part of it that I do think it would help would be, first of all, to increase the property value of the people who have decided to stay here, so that when they decide to sell, they will have a more valuable property. And when we do get some family units that do come together that want to have a space for their mom to take care of the kids, or to be able to have a space to work in. I mean, that's another thing that we're seeing now. An ADU could be a workspace for somebody. I remember in the beginning of this thing, we were talking how many different ways an ADU could be used. So, I see it as Zoe said, a great middle for a bunch of different uses, and also there's so many boomerang families. I happen to be one. It's a great opportunity if your kids have to come home from wherever it is they are, and they're not always in their 20s. Sometimes they're in their 30s or 40s, or whatever, and it just doesn't work to live together. So I do think it would be a great option for Montclair.
So there's evidence from around the rest of the country, but you think it might be true here that an ADU might actually increase the resale or property value?
I absolutely do. I mean, we don't know until we see it, but I absolutely don't. If some, especially, depending on what rules the town enforces, if these units are rentable, then, that's always a plus. People are always interested in having that option.
Eli mentioned that one of the arguments in favor of ADUs is the basic libertarian argument. I own the property. If I have a detached garage in my yard, why can't I extract the value of letting someone live there? I think we all have experiences in different ways with where the libertarian argument ends, which is when your neighbors get together and pass a law, right?
Right.
So let's talk about that for a second. Laszlo, let me start with you. Can we build ADUs that will be efficient enough for us and friendly enough, comfortable and private enough for us to use them, inexpensive enough to be possibly using modular designs like you've mentioned, but also unobtrusive enough that it won't immediately cause a firestorm of protest from your neighbors? Your neighbors may be okay with you doing whatever you want in your house. They may not be so okay with you doing whatever you want on your external property, if it includes demolition or new building or even just new people, right? Do you think those challenges can all be met simultaneously through the right kind of design?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball and I don't live in the North Pole, so it's very hard to address these. You know,
Well, I should have said, could you do it? If I brought you to my, can you do it? Could you design
well,
an ADU that you think would
I've encountered in my life, I've encountered very weird situations, and you run into NIMBYism in areas that you don't even think you would be running into. The first house I built in North Caldwell was denied initially a permit because it didn't look colonial. They just didn't understand it. So they said, well, our town is colonial, you don't look colonial. Therefore, and we wanted to face the garage to the street and stuff like that. That was not legal, and that's the only way we could do it. So anyway, so you can run into all sorts of funny stuff. I don't know if I could use my time in an efficient way. Maybe try to sort of give you an idea of what does modular involved in a very quick way, because I have a presentation that I made. It's actually a professional continuing education presentation that I give, but there's a portion in there that I could just quickly run over, and you could sort of start seeing what we're talking about in terms of what it looks like. This is a little bit more modern, but you'll see. But these, what the restrictions are, and how maybe modular or prefabrication, because prefabrication is a very broad thing. There's many aspects to it. Windows are actually prefabricated. We don't make them on site anymore. So that's one aspect. But when you put all those components together into something larger, so if I could, let me see if I can share my screen.
Sure. Could you just start by defining for us, just for folks, possibly including myself, who don't know exactly what modular means? Is modular?
So what? Yeah, that's what I wanted to see if I could.
Sure.
This defines it, and this is like 2 or 3 slides that, if I can just play from here. So let me see if I can share my screen. But okay, how do I share screen? Okay. Oh, come on. Share screen.
Okay, well, what we could do.
Okay, never mind.
Okay.
All right. So let me define you without visuals here. A module or modular and a module refers to something that's built in the factory, usually in a controlled environment, and it has a roof and a floor and all 4 walls. It's usually comes fully plumbed. It's electrically built out. So it has the services that just need to be hooked up to the outside. Windows are installed, sheetrock is installed. On this scale, the flooring would be installed. So essentially, it's a finished building that is carted down the road and then craned onto a foundation. When it's done, it's actually just like site built. It's probably a little bit better in terms that it's, in order for the module to travel from a factory a couple of 100 miles away to your site, not only is it nailed together, but it's screwed and glued, and the sheetrock is glued on, so you won't have nails popping and some of the typical things that happen after new construction. It's treated just like any other on-site built building. So Eli was talking about it's very hard to achieve scale with these because they're always one-offs. So my suggestion was, if you created 1 or 2 models that were floor plans that the factory had engineered and they were ready to build them as you needed them, that starts bringing scale, because factories tend to buy in bulk, so their pricing is lower. The labor is in middle Pennsylvania versus here, therefore it's lower. So you're starting to take advantage of some of that labor, material costs. And if you're making more than one, then the factory cost of creating the drawings and managing is also now starting to be divided over the cost of, you may be making 10 of those. So now you're dividing the engineering cost over 10 versus over 1. So if the engineering costs are $10,000, well, then it's only $1,000 per unit. So this is how you start achieving scale. And
Okay,
I think that's what you need.
So we're going to, for this to happen in a big way, folks will have to be able to have access to contractors and advice and be able to lower costs by it happening across a larger scale. There's a few other things that have to happen, right? We're talking about an ordinance. There has to be better financing or more access to financing for these to happen. Let me ask about the political factors involved here also. We saw that 8 states have legalized ADUs. We've seen a couple of jurisdictions where they've been successful. Zoe, can I ask you about what happened with New York recently, where the governor seemed set to sign legislation that would have legalized ADUs, but I believe, I'm not an expert in this, but you tell me if I'm wrong, I believe she backed off because of the opposition of suburban state legislators. Okay, we've heard so much about the benefits across time, across generations of families, how this will help resale value and neighborhood, the culture of the neighborhood. Okay, there's wide sidewalks, there's blue skies. Who opposes this, and who opposes it strongly enough that they were able to influence statewide policy, seemed to me at the very last second, and kill the idea in New York State? Who's the driving force that could stop this idea from taking off?
It's not who is the driving force. It's not one person that exists only in New York. What it really is this kind of visceral response to like home rule. Home rule is the name of the game here. New Jersey is steeped in it. And in New York, it more takes the form of what you just referenced, where it's kind of a suburban fear of density. And it's just, I don't know how to put that correctly, but when you have, just because it's a good idea and it should go forward doesn't mean the politics let it, right? And so in New Jersey, when we had the hearing on accessory dwelling units, the League of Municipalities came out against, and to be honest, there was some pushback because of this fear of who would move into these. It's going to be too crowded. There's going to be parking issues. There's, you know what I mean? It's like kind of just like a litany of things that are all manageable. And I'm sorry.
I was going to ask Peter, you're plugged in everywhere. Do you feel that to be already true here? Have you felt any kind of visceral opposition to this idea? And if so, because I'm sure there will be always somebody opposes something, right? Do you believe that the ordinance the local ordinance here could ultimately be crafted to take care of those concerns? Because I think it is true that a lot of people define their life in a suburban home not necessarily by all the wonderful things we have here, but by the fact that they're not in a dense building in an urban environment, and they tend to react very strongly against anything, not just demographically, but even architecturally, right? Or planning wise, that suggests that somehow floors that they don't want or buildings they don't want are going to kind of intrude on our tree-lined existence. So I guess my question is, are you sensing that already? And 2 is, do you think we can the municipal ordinance can deal with that in a way that's productive?
I think it can. I think from a macro perspective, first of all, education is key here, right? That's the most important thing. I don't think we should. I think we have to be really mindful that we don't get ahead of our skis. And I respect Laszlo's comments, but I think talking about type of construction and prefab and all of that is getting way, way, way ahead of where we are right now as a community. So I do want to kind of bring us back to where we are, which is that we have a council that's going to be divided on this issue. The design of our government, I think, is very intelligent in that there are 3 at-large members of the council and then 4 regional members of the council in terms of representing 4 wards throughout the town, right? So the balance is really interesting. You've got 4 essential champions of their neighborhood, of their section of Montclair, sitting on a council with 3 of us who have an at-large perspective. So I really do see it as part of my role from an at-large perspective to be thinking about these issues from a macro perspective, right? Our housing market, as I mentioned earlier, and thinking about a more scalpel smart, intelligent approach to development and helping with affordability, aging in place, and all those issues mentioned earlier. Not in my backyardism is a issue on every issue across the board that you can imagine. I mean, I do get tons of emails and communication about everything. Everybody, of course, has an opinion on everything, and everybody's a Google expert on everything when you're in these modern times. So I take it all, in, and I try to digest it and be tuned into what I think is what is the true sentiment here. And ultimately, I do think this comes down to where I started with education, right? Like, and being really, really clear about what the intentions are and not trying to pull the wool over anyone's eyes. And so I do think we would be starting with a scalpel approach, really, really sharp, right? In particular, where these are going to be, how many we would approve in each ward of the town, very specific rules around setbacks and design, needing to be owner occupied and max capacity. There are legitimate concerns for people, right? And you alluded to this in your comments a few minutes ago. I move into a house, I buy a piece of property. I'm in between two other single family homes. I don't necessarily anticipate that the home next to me is going to construct an accessory dwelling unit that could include another family. And so there will be more people, more commotion, more coming and going, et cetera. So I think it's a genuine concern. I think it's fair and reasonable. But I do think, back to the earlier conversation, if we're talking about this from an aging in place, and we're talking about this from a family cohesion perspective, families being able to plan over decades, by the way, how to stay together. Just one little anecdotal piece. I grew up in a big Italian family in Queens. We all lived in the same neighborhood, everybody scattered in the late 80s to Long Island and the suburbs. And now we're across 10 states where we all were in one neighborhood, right? And the underpinning reason for that is affordability. So I do think revisiting this conversation about the family unit and community in America and in places like Montclair, where I constantly hear it's so important that families want to be able to stay together, whether that's aging in place or whether that's their kids being able to come back after college and afford to live in Montclair and not live in one of the big developments. I just think it's a really, really interesting context to this conversation. It's about not just older residents aging in place, it's actually about families growing in place, right? So
yes.
Anyway.
And that's why I was so struck by something Eli said earlier, because there's evidence that it tilts the right way when it's allowed to have. And when he said that ADUs, when you allow them within the existing homeownership rules and structure, that experience shows it's not companies coming in trying to buy these, whether that's legal or not, or there's not an epidemic of flipping that goes on. Families are basically using this not as a commercial enterprise, but as a tactic to keep everybody closer together than they would otherwise ever afford to be able to live.
Yeah, and to your point, or someone's point earlier, but the boomerang, I think so many of us, myself included, I moved out first, right? And then I came and moved back home, and then I moved out again. Wouldn't it be great if families were able to have these units above the garage or attached to the units where, college kids, when they come back from college, can live with their families, and you can have a few years to stash up some money to be able to afford your own home in town if that's what you wanted to do or in the area. So I do see that when we talk about the missing middle from an architecture perspective or a density perspective, I think the missing middle also applies to someone's life journey, right? We all, not all, but so many of us, you graduate college, you're saddled with college debt, and most of us aren't in the position to buy a home in the suburbs. So wouldn't it be great if there was this transitional place for young people?
That's interesting because it's almost become an inevitability, right? That when kids graduate high school, maybe they go to college, maybe they go for 4 years, maybe 2, maybe 6, who knows? But there's no guarantee they even are thinking about coming back. It can cease to even be an imaginative. Nobody in there has even in their imagination that we're going to do is come back and buy a $900,000 home because they got their first job. It'd be fascinating for that to bring that back into people's imagination, wouldn't it? For the dynamics not to always just be driving people apart, driving families apart. So that's interesting, and it's also interesting. Of course, the arguments on against or the feelings against this have to be. Everybody has to deal with this respectfully and hopefully educationally. I mean, in this case, not in my backyard isn't even a metaphor, right? It's actually, I literally don't want this in my backyard, but there's all this evidence to show that it can increase property values, that structured the right way, it doesn't have to increase parking or, rec rules about setbacks or land use, and can be done in an attractive style. But it's interesting, like it takes a lot of work for something like this to be a win-win rather than to become immediately polarized. I think the default option in almost everything today, right, is for something to quickly become polarized. A lot of folks think somebody's coming for them, right?
Yeah, and if I could just add, just a couple points in terms of what's in our draft law that we are considering,
Yes.
is that it would be owner occupied in terms of the ADU, or the primary would have to be occupied by the owner. We would require one off-street parking spot for an accessory dwelling unit, and we would cap it at 4 people in terms of number of residents in an accessory dwelling unit. As well. So I think, just understanding, and for the public to understand some of the parameters that we're already talking about and that we're working within, just to immediately address some of those concerns.
And that's 4 people in the ADU.
Correct.
Right. Well, those seem to be within the realm of how most ADUs are already being used, right? Those limits. It doesn't seem, and they also don't seem to be any drastically bad news for anybody who's living near an ADU. Seems like that overlap could be, seems like that overlap could work. Fingers crossed. Do you have a timetable that you're working on in terms of presenting that, or somebody presenting that as an actual proposal?
Yeah, we are, having conversations, and I say we, my colleagues, Councilor Price Abrams, Councilor Russo, we were part of this working group from the beginning, and we are having those conversations with Ms. Talley and Carmel Lockman and others on the group, with council colleagues, with the mayor, et cetera, to, just start to hear out what are their concerns, right? And I think for my colleagues, and I think for the community at large, there are always going to be these, embedded legacy perspectives, right? And I think the most important conversation is, are you open to getting more information? Are you open to hearing different perspectives? Can I talk to you about some of the data that we have around some of these concerns or issues that you may have? So, I'm meaning scalpel and sledgehammer in so many different contexts in this conversation. What I don't want to do is, go hard and fast and beat people over the head with this. I want to hear and listen and understand concerns and address them, and make sure that everybody's working off the same facts and information, and that what we're doing is really supported by data and trends that we're seeing around the country. So that's why I'm so appreciative of an educational session like this, because I do think this is so important to get folks, to understand really what these issues are, and most importantly, to dispel of the myths that are out there around accessory dwelling units.
Yeah, I just want to add on one thing just to bring it back to your original question. I think Peter just hit it on the head. You want to know what kills accessory dwelling unit ordinances? It's misinformation, and it's really critical to have things like this. And I was glad to hear what Peter was saying about some of these details, and people were responding in the chat, because it's a visceral concern about things that aren't explained. And so I think that you're going about it the right way, and it's really great to see.
Robin, you're nodding about that. Is there something you would tell people who come to you looking for home buying help, or just information about the area, about this subject? I mean, something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, all of the information that was here today is great information, and I would hope that we can get it out in a way that will dispel a lot of the fear that people are going to have for this. And I think, it would be very great for the realtor community to get involved and start to put the word out too. And I think that we could be really helpful with that, because, I just think it's a great thing for the community. So yeah, I agree with Zoe. We need, there's always somebody who's going to be out there screaming from the rooftops about how awful this is. And you need to get ahead of that as much as you can.
All right. I think if it's okay with you guys, we have a few questions from the Q&A that have been submitted. I think Anne or possibly Harold will pop back on with some queries if we can do that.
So
Welcome back again.
Very stimulating discussion. And again, I want to assure you all that this is being recorded and that will be available on demand from our portal and also on TV 34 because we know how important the educational process is here. And as Zoe said, we really want people to know the facts and not deal on misinformation. Okay. Some of the questions, I'm going to give Harold the chance to be first this time.
Well, I'm going to start with Peter, and I want to thank you for all the work that you've done. I learned a lot about housing from you, given the experience that you've had in New York and maybe other places in the housing field, and I really appreciate that. How can the attendees from Montclair, we have actually people from all over the country, but mostly from Montclair, how can we help move the proposed ordinance?
So I think what we should probably do is put out some simple facts about it. I don't necessarily think it's critical to put out all the different, whereas and know that and now therefore paragraphs, but I think a simple one-page fact sheet about what certain decisions are already in terms of what it currently looks like, what it does and doesn't do, could be really, really important. And just making sure that everybody is sharing a presentation like this, sharing a fact sheet like this, writing op-eds in the papers, and then taking the time to make your educated position known to your representatives like me and my colleagues. I think that's the most important thing everybody can do.
Okay. We have some interesting little tidbits here about some intergenerational work that was done. In Roxbury, high school students build a modular home with the help of Morris Habitat, and that was just transferred to the township of Linden. A family from Orange won the lottery and will move into that small home. Great story. Okay, back to you, Harold.
Robin, back in 2000, when I became active in Montclair housing issues, one of the big things that I heard then was that we need more housing that's affordable to young people whose own children, we heard that a lot from people whose own children graduating college couldn't afford to move back to Montclair. Have you heard much of this, and how do you think this proposed ordinance would help you in dealing with that question?
I mean, I think things have changed a lot since 2000. And I think what you see happening is that the people who are worried about their kids moving back to Montclair have themselves moved. So, I think we see much less. I don't hear that particularly. I'm generally helping people my age, downsize rather than, look to have their kids move here. And I have to say that most of the people who are moving here have to be fairly affluent. Montclair property values have gone up substantially, even in the last year. So, we're not seeing a wide variety of socioeconomic difference coming into the town right now.
I would just add, it works both ways. My older daughter is a junior in college right now, and not only is she unlikely to be able to afford a down payment or a mortgage on a house, but I don't think she wants to be constrained in her choice of jobs by having to make enough money to do that. So I'm afraid we've lost or are in the process of rapidly losing 2 whole generations of people since 2000, because not only they're not going to make enough money, but I wonder if in this very blue town, generating very civically involved young people in this time, whether anyone want to just go to Wall Street to try to make the money to be able to put a down payment on a house at the cost that we have here now in town. So I think it actually, unfortunately, works negatively both ways. But that's my experience.
And I think that that's why ADUs could be helpful if we had, if there were parents that were staying. I mean, there are a number of people that do pay their houses off and basically have, a property tax payment yearly and can afford to stay here. If they could put an ADU in their backyard and their kids could come back, I think we would see more of that. And maybe seeing more families staying together generationally.
So, Robin, I have a follow-up question, and then we'll get to Peter. any of the potential purchases of properties that you're showing now, do you hear any of them being turned off by the concept of having some sort of an ADU-like rental property on their new homeowner single-family lot?
No, I mean, most people who are out there buying would value that sort of thing because it would represent additional income for them if the property, kind of was conducive to that. I'm not saying everybody would. How they would feel after they bought and somebody put on a unit as a neighbor, I think that's just an individual situation. Do you know what I mean? I wouldn't be able to say how people feel about it. And again, I'll go back to what Peter says. It's an educational thing. It's just getting people up to speed.
So Peter Yacobellis, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, how much I do think this is one of many tools in the toolbox for affordability and for having families be able to stay together in Montclair, which is, by the way, that is what I hear all of the time. It's the thing I hear most about, even more than leaf blowers. Those of you in Montclair will appreciate that joke. And look, I'm proud of what we did in terms of rent control, because rent control is really about people who live here now and families who live here now, and saying you can't raise rents more than 4% per year, or 2.5% if you're a senior on most rentals now in Montclair. That's a big deal. I think we have to do a better job, frankly, of incentivizing more affordable housing, and we look at zoning in certain areas as well for where there could be opportunity for more density. In a respectful and intelligent way, and make sure we're bringing that affordable housing in. So between rent control, a strategy around affordable housing, ADUs, handling that carefully, all of these things together can potentially help turn the tide a little bit. I don't think we're ever going backwards. I don't think property values are going to go down substantially in Montclair anytime soon, or taxes, frankly. I think we are where we are, and the best we can do is blunt that trajectory. So instead of like this, it's maybe like this, right? And I think that's what this conversation is partly about.
I have a question for Zoe and Peter. Same question. Peter, you mentioned some incentives that we can provide. What, Zoe and Peter, what incentives might encourage the production of ADUs in either any town or our town?
Was that, sorry, for Peter Keating or for me?
No, I'm sorry, for you, Peter Yacobellis.
I don't know that we're...
You had mentioned it.
Yeah, so the way I look at this now, probably for our first, I know we have an existing ordinance, but for this ordinance that we're talking about, would probably be more so to address pent up demand, right? And scratch the surface on interest. I don't necessarily see us going as far as incentivizing them yet. I think, Montclair is definitely a place where you have to test things out and show people proof of concept before you go too far. Mm-hmm. So I see us going there eventually, right? You get a few of these, people realize the sky's not falling in. Okay, now how can we, people feel good about it, they feel okay about it. Now how can we incentivize it in a smart and diplomatic and thoughtful way?
I would add to that, I think there's a line, right, between what's incentive. When you say incentive, people often think of financial incentive, and that's not the only thing that is supportive. And so I think what communities should look at is kind of like what was, in some of my slides, or what is some of the supportive infrastructure that you could help add? For example, is there a way to have resources like the website that San Mateo County did? Are there ways to, using, for example, an organization like Montclair Gateway, create a link up system for people that do have ADUs with seniors that need to, are looking for a rental, and so you can do some of those softer back end side of it to really like prop up the system and make it more meaningful to people. And I think that would be helpful just in getting it done. And then just as an aside, the big incentive that I mentioned that I was super impressed by was the Biden administration's very recent announcement that they were going to, for those of you that don't work in government, the way your applications for competitive grants are ranked based on varying criteria, and getting a little boost in that. If you have good zoning, that's fantastic. That's huge, because I want to flag that this infrastructure money that we just got, it's a 5 to 8 year bill, depending on what section you're looking at. So this is something that could pay dividends like in the long term for the community.
Let me just add one thing, because I should have brought it up earlier. Legalization in itself is an incentive for folks who already have ADUs off the books. If you walk around town, you'll see a lot of carriage houses, including many detached dwelling units that aren't necessarily built alongside the most extraordinarily wealthy homes in town. They're just spaces that people either are taking advantage of or compelled to use, even if it's not legal. And that presents some dangers, particularly safety dangers. I mean, it's always better to have a safer, well-regulated market than a black market, right? If people are going to do something anyway. And in Hurricane Ida, there were at least 30 who died. Maybe it wasn't a shock to see basement apartments flooded in New York City in illegal buildings or whatever, but there were units that did not hold up under bad weather, which is only going to keep getting worse here in New Jersey, that led to actual deaths. And there are ADUs in Montclair right now, whether they're legal or not. And I think, it's a pretty good argument that we should bring them on the books somehow.
Okay.
I just wanted to say quickly that I think Laszlo's suggestion about pre-approved plans would go a long, long way, cutting the cost and making sure the town has all its regs followed, not just for manufactured or modular, but whatever it is. Having something in place would save homeowners money and time, and would assure neighbors and other residents that the code is being followed.
Okay, with that, we are running out of time. I just want to say a few things. First of all, this was a very invigorating conversation, and we're really very grateful to you. Laszlo, we'd like to have your resources up on our resource library, so after the fact, we'll get those up there. And those of you who are asking, how do you get to the resource library? Well, you're going to have to wait till the end of the program, because that's when I'm going to tell you how. And lastly, when Janice Talley gets on and Marina Rubina in the last discussion, you'll hear some more specifics about definitions. Carriage houses are legal in Montclair, and I'm sure Janice will make the distinction between an ADU and a carriage house with respect to our town's ordinances. And we also want to give you another chance to have a break, because you've been sitting here for a long time, and we will follow the break with another video. So we're going to take a 6-minute break or a 5-minute break, and we'll see you on the other side, okay? Welcome back, everyone. We're just queuing up for our next video. Testimonials are often very helpful to helping put things into context. The next video is from Connecticut. The Wolin family figured out how to improve their life and their lives going forward by creating an ADU during the pandemic. This video comes to us from the Desegregate Connecticut initiative. And now let's see the video.
Christina had to move out right when she was incredibly vulnerable, and it broke our hearts.
I worked the COVID wing. When the COVID first hit, nobody really knew what was going on.
Then it dawned on us that we could put together the complements of an apartment.
There, you have your own entrance, you have a full kitchen, you have an eating area, you have your own bedroom, you have your own bathroom.
The ADU didn't present anything much different than somebody building a house, but in this case, it was a house within a house.
And still be able to save money and fulfill some of those dreams that I have, like I'm sure many people do, of owning a home someday. Without something like this, it'd be very hard to make that dream a reality.
We don't have to grow old by ourselves. We love it that we have an opportunity to be in a handicapped accessible place to be with our kids right upstairs so that they're checking on us. I think everybody ought to consider this if they have the option at all. And it's going to be easier now. The steps will be in place. I just think that's great. It gives me peace.
And as some of our panelists have said, the idea of multi-generational residence where you can have some independence and yet have the comfort of knowing that there's someone there to help out when needed is very, very promising. Now, we're moving to a little bit more practical session in which we're going to look at how do we get it done here. Janice Talley is the Director of Planning and Community Development, and Marina Rubina is a Princeton architect. She's an architect from Princeton who has her own firm and has been responsible largely for creating some very interesting ADUs. And I'm going to hand this over to Harold now, who is going to moderate the panel.
Thank you, Anne. Hello, everyone. As Anne said, my name is Harold Simon, and I was, for 27 years, the executive director of the National Housing Institute and publisher of Shelterforce magazine. I helped found the only active affordable housing community land trust in New Jersey, and I'm the president of that board, and I'm on the Montclair Housing Commission. We've had a great symposium so far with lots of information on what ADUs are, some of the policy issues surrounding ADUs, and the value they add for homeowners and communities. By now, you may be thinking, well, what do I do to build one of these? This wrap-up session will offer some important guidance. Two of the most important people you'll need if you're going to build an ADU in Montclair is a town planner and an architect. We're fortunate, as Anne said, to have Janice Talley, who is the Director of Planning for Montclair Township and is a licensed professional planner with over 30 years of experience. And Marina Rubina, a great architect based in Princeton, New Jersey, who probably has the most experience in designing ADUs of any architect in the state. Each of them will tell you about their experience working with folks who want to build an ADU. We hope you leave this session and the whole symposium with a good understanding of the current status of ADUs in Montclair, the benefits less restrictive ADU regs could offer the township, and how to select and work with an architect to get what you want at a price you can afford. I'm told you can't see me, but you saw the nice river behind me. After each of them makes a brief presentation, we'll open it up to questions. And I'll stop talking now and turn it over to Janice.
Okay, thank you. You can hear me now, right? Okay, thank you, Harold, for the introduction. And this has been a really good session. I think a lot of information has been presented, very valuable information. I just want to start off a little bit about the history of accessory dwelling units in Montclair, because this is really, it isn't something that's new to us. We adopted an ordinance, our first ADU ordinance back in 1980, and that legitimized carriage houses, which historically have included dwelling units, and it legitimized carriage houses as accessory dwelling units in the town if they had previously been used for occupancy. We also, at that same time, established an accessory dwelling unit ordinance that allowed accessory dwelling units for limited only to parents. So I think that the issue with our existing accessory dwelling unit ordinances is that they were very, very limiting. In both cases, they're permitted only as conditional uses, which means in order to create one of those units, you had to go to the planning board, you had to notice for it, you have to notice your neighbors, and you had to get permission from the planning board to create those accessory dwelling units. In addition, at least for the ADU, the occupancy is limited only to parents of the homeowner. And there were additional requirements regarding the design of the unit. In particular, the design of the unit could not require any addition to the house. It would have to be within the existing dimensions of the house. Nevertheless, that ordinance has been in the books since 1980. In my tenure here for about 12 years, we've had probably about 4 applications for accessory dwelling units. All of them have been approved. But I think that there are enormous hurdles for homeowners to overcome in order to create those units. An additional issue is you have to deed restrict the unit. If it's an accessory dwelling unit for parents only, you have to sign a deed restriction saying that accessory dwelling unit is only for your parents. And in fact, you have to say that the agree to removing the kitchen when the parents are no longer residing in that unit. So the issue here is it's a significant investment in this accessory dwelling unit, and to require that it expire upon no longer being used by the parents, I think is a significant limitation. I think if we fast forward 50 years from 1980, or 40 years from 1980, when this ordinance was originally put in place, there's been a significant change, I think, in how people live, particularly since the pandemic. Not only are these accessory dwelling units very useful for intergenerational living, but with the pandemic, there's a lot more people who are working at home. So the space within existing homes are now being used not only as a residence, but they're also being used for office uses for a lot of homeowners here as well. So there's a bit of a space crunch. And if you add to that the exorbitant of cost of housing and the distinct trend of boomerang housing with children coming back to live at home, or the need for caregivers, be whatever it may, I think there's a pent-up demand for this type of flexibility in how people can utilize their houses. And that's really what this ordinance that we've been working on for the past 2 years has been designed to provide that kind of flexibility. In the end, I don't think it's really going to change. If it's adopted, it's not going to change the appearance of our residential districts. We've tried to craft the ordinance so that the appearance of the single family house from the street will not change. It's not going to impact the privacy of the neighbors, because any accessory dwelling unit would have to either be within the house, attached to the house, or it'd have to be on the first floor of an accessory structure on the property. It would have to meet our current setback requirements and our current building coverage requirements, and we have those for the entire lot. We also have that as it applies to the rear yard. So there are a number of requirements that we're trying to build into the ordinance to make accessory dwelling units integrate them seamlessly into existing neighborhoods. And I think one thing to consider for those of you who are participating today, who are in Montclair, we already have these units. The problem is you really don't see them because of the way they've been designed, either as a carriage house or an accessory dwelling unit. You don't see them from the street, at least in the single family residential zone districts. They're hidden, they're in the back. The other concern that I know I've heard from discussions with people in the community is the potential impact to density. And I don't think with the requirements that we're building into the ordinance that the ADU program would significantly change density in our districts. Right now, just so that you may not be aware, we do allow boarders in single family houses. It's in our definition of family. So if you have some empty bedrooms that are being underutilized, you are allowed to rent those out. The key difference is between a boarder and an accessory dwelling unit is the accessory dwelling unit has separate access. It's not access through the main residential home, and it has a kitchen. So at the end of the day, I think if we move ahead with this, it would provide another source of less expensive housing, more affordable housing, smaller units in the community. It would be distributed throughout the community because we do have a lot of single-family residential districts. And because of that distribution, we could provide this more affordable housing option with very minimal impacts. That's basically it for now.
Thank you, Janice. Before I turn to Marina, I just want to underline something you said. We have been working on it and I'm part of the committee, for quite a number of years, for 2 years, and we listened very carefully to other communities and what the concerns were of their residents. And when we built this ordinance, we tried to be very cognizant of that. And I think we were very successful in crafting something that would add additional units without changing the character or significantly changing the density, and without the town having to spend any significant amount on infrastructure, which is very important. Anyhow, I'm going to turn it over to Marina now.
Hello, and I would like to thank you guys for having such a wonderful conversation this afternoon, and tell you that I'm here in Princeton, where we have, similarly to what Janice mentioned, we had a secondary dwelling unit ordinance for many, many years, and it has been in the last couple of years formalized as an accessory dwelling unit ordinance, and we have been working on them and building them and helping people put these together. So I am here to share how we've been doing this. So in case you succeed in passing this ordinance, you will have a sense of how to actually do this when the time comes. So I will share my screen and give you a brief overview of how would you do the ADU if and when it becomes an option. So any undertaking, any project that people will embark on, and whether this is a construction of accessory dwelling unit, addition to their home, or even passing an ordinance, it's a stressful situation, and everyone needs to think, what is the right level of stress in their life that they can handle? And what we're trying to say, that there's good stress and then there's bad stress. So every single person needs to think of it as, I'm embarking on an adventure in my life, and what level of adventure and stress is right for me. And what kind of help do I need to have on my journey to make this level of stress the right one for me? So in addition to being an architect and a mom, I also happen to be a rock climber. So I will give you a sense of examples or inspiration based on my rock climbing experience. So I don't know if any of you have seen this movie, Free Solo, but this is about a climber who goes and climbs a huge mountain without any safety. So he, as you can see here, he is just climbing. There is no rope holding him up. So I would use this as sort of the huge, huge risk that he's taking, right? What is your level of risk that you're able to take on in building an accessory dwelling unit by yourself? And the point I'm trying to make is you have to think about, what if I fail? What if something goes wrong? What if I need to start over? And to think about, if I could do this all by myself, it's a huge time investment. Alex clearly didn't just wake up one morning and walk up to the mountain and did this all by himself. There were years and years of training, planning, things that went in order to make this happening. So if you have the investment of time and you can prepare and you can research and do it all by yourself, by all means, it's an incredible adventure. Or if you already have the skills, by all means. However, I'm not like Alex. I don't go climbing mountains without pretension. This is more what it looks like with regular people when they go climbing. There's a lot of equipment. There are books. You just stand there and think and try to figure out and plan. But the risk is much lower because you are on a rope, you're being supported, you brought people with you who have done this before. You have the equipment, you have the ability to do this, but it doesn't mean that you're not having fun and it's not a great adventure and you don't get a great achievement out of it. It's still just trying to figure out, what can I do? What level of risk is appropriate for me so that I could do this and still get the result that I want. So what I'm going to walk you through today is what I think would be a roadmap of how you could go about designing an accessory dwelling unit. And it's not that different from, it is different, but not necessarily from doing other work on your home or remodeling or adding. So the first step would be to do your research and really try to understand what type of people you're looking to work with. Is it that you're going to do it by yourself? That's wonderful. You have the time to invest, or do you need help? So the people who could be your people who are holding the other end of the rope, the architects and the builders that you are going to be working with. For sure, you're not going to get anywhere without a site survey. In New Jersey, normally when we purchase properties, that survey is part of the purchasing process. So everybody probably has one. Even if it's an older one, no worries. And then I would strongly suggest looking for inspirational images, trying to find, what do I want this to look like? What do I want this to feel like? So I'm going to sprinkle my presentation with a lot of pictures of my work that is applicable, and most of it is accessory dwelling units in this particular case, and how to use space efficiently, for example, without having a really huge space. How do you make it multi-purpose? Whether you put a little bay window and this is your office in your bedroom. So the next step is, after you've done the research and you understand what type of professionals are around, I would really strongly suggest understanding, why am I doing this ADU? What are the goals that I am trying to achieve? And those are going to be your guiding principles throughout the whole process. Is it because I need this for my parents? Is it because I need it for my office? Do I need this for income? Having a clear understanding of these goals will be huge, huge, huge asset as you work through the process. And then I would start with selecting an architect and researching with that architect what is possible on my property. What are the rules and the regulations that govern what is possible and what's not possible? So for example, this is a picture of a building that I have worked on, and this is the original state when it was first purchased. And you will see it develop throughout time as the accessory dwelling unit develops. So once you've found an architect that you really like, the first step is schematic design. So what we do is we provide you with different options. And these are literally this picture of my desk with sketches. And you can see, here's a plan of a house, here's an ADU. How is this going to work? And I strongly recommend that it's really important to look at things early on and very schematically, because before doing a huge investment, try to understand, does this work? And always remember, what were my goals? Is this meeting my goals? So then the next step would be, after you have very sketchy, very preliminary ideas, try to think about, how much is this going to cost? How am I going to do it? what is the right approach for me? So you would interview builders and get preliminary cost estimates. But also, it's not just about the cost. It's about, these are the people that are going to be, because this is your home, where you live, and this accessory dwelling unit is going to be right there. You're going to be living with this contractor effectively for the next year. So you need to have compatible personalities to make sure this person is not going to drive you crazy being in your house every day. And just as Laszlo mentioned, I'm also a big fan of prefabrication, but you have to weigh in all the pros and cons. So what kind of professional services are needed? You will, depending on where your home is located and whether the accessory dwelling unit is inside or outside, you're going to need other team members. You're going to need civil engineers, possibly a structural engineer, possibly a planner if you're trying to do this accessory dwelling unit, as Janice said, under the current regulations where it requires going in front of the board. So I would think, again, compared to my goals, what is the best approach? What's the best level of risk for me? And some people really like working with contractors who I call the guy with the truck, where this is their office, right? Some people really get a sense of comfort where they go to big corporate office and it looks really nice and everything's organized and a lot of spreadsheets. That works for other people. This is a modular project similar to what Laszlo was explaining and describing, where it's done in a factory. You could go visit the factory when it's being built, and then it's brought and set by crane. That provides a wonderful level of efficiencies if you could get the crane on your property. So here's an example when, let's say, you've decided this is what we're doing, this is the direction we're leading. How do we pay for this? What are the financing options? And at the moment, it's a little bit complicated, but effectively there are two ways to go about this. One is financing an accessory dwelling unit just like you would any addition to a single family home. You would get a home equity loan, get a loan from friends and family, maybe you have money in the bank. As we've mentioned, there are multiple programs that are trying to be proactive and put together that are not quite up and running yet, but will be soon, that allow the rental income from the future accessory dwelling unit to be incorporated in the amount of loan that you could borrow. And that is the big proposal that the White House is pushing, and this is what they're trying to instruct Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to back. But what that would allow you to do is basically borrow more money because the income from the future accessory dwelling unit would be incorporated into the loan that you are allowed to buy. And the reason that I included this picture here is this is a house that I helped remodel here in Princeton a while back. And this is, I'm not sure if you guys have them, but we have a lot of split levels. So this is a typical split level, and guess where the ADU is? Right here. This is an accessory dwelling unit, and here's Michelle, the homeowner, and this is her house, and this accessory dwelling unit has been used. They have rented it out to people who work at Princeton University. Their daughter had stayed there in multiple locations. During COVID, they've used it for office space. It had many different functions. But again, from just looking at it, you wouldn't even know. So as you move forward with your project roadmap, once you've settled on what type of construction, who you would like to work with, you move into what we in the profession call design development and documentation, where it shifts more towards professionals developing more technical drawings. And this is where you would determine whether this would be as of right or this would be a variance. So at the moment, if you were to decide to do this accessory dwelling unit in Montclair, this would require not a variance, but it's a conditional use. So you would have to go in front of the board. If your ordinance passes, then that step would be removed and it will be easier to get administrative approvals. So this is an example, if you remember that two-story home that I showed with a front porch. So the way that this building was converted is on the ground floor you enter, and the whole ground floor is an accessory dwelling unit, and there's a little gate, and you go down in the back, down this beautiful pathway, and then there's a new stair that leads to, actually the larger unit is upstairs. And something that I think is really key, and I think many people today mentioned, is this concept of flexibility. And trying to remember that even in your final pricing, what we call, there's this big scary word called value engineering. And this is going back to thinking, what were my goals? What am I trying to achieve? What can I afford? And the design process and the construction process are not linear. We constantly go around in these circles and we make decisions as we go along. So at first, these circles are really big. We're making big decisions. Is the accessory dwelling unit inside? Is it outside? Is it attached, detached? Where is it? But these decisions and these iterations, they never cease. Even after you move in, they still continue. Do I paint the bathroom pink? You know, these will be through, these decisions will continue throughout the life of the building. And maintaining that flexibility and thinking back, what are the things that are really important to me and what can I afford on my budget? So here's an example. This is that accessory dwelling unit, the ground floor accessory dwelling unit. So here's the kitchen. And this was the original design. This is a 3D model. And as we started construction, we found out that, certain things were not available. For example, we weren't able to do this wood on the front of the island because we had to include actually an HVAC register and it didn't work. So we were constantly trying to evaluate what are the things that are really important and make a difference and meet our goals. At the same time, other things that are flexible. Does it matter what material it is? Maybe it doesn't matter. What does really matter is the openness and the space and the durability. So here is the completed project, if you remember that house, right? So this is the entrance, and this happens to be that accessory dwelling unit. And as you go down this little passageway, you go upstairs, and this is the main home happens to be on the second floor. And this is the rear of the whole building where the porch and the front yard go with the bottom unit and the backyard goes with the upper unit. And here are, did I say that? Yes. So during the construction project, this is the final phase where your contractor is building. And again, remember, you're living with this person. Even if it's modular, you still have to have a contractor. You have to have a good working relationship. You have to be comfortable with this person being in your home. And once you're done, the architects and the engineers are part of your team and they continue to be with you. And if you want help during the process, they stay with the project. And then when you're done, here you are, right? So some of the, oh yeah, right. This is my picture. Remember I said that there's an alley. So this would be the gate. And you open the gate, here's the mailbox, and the only thing different from the street that would be a secondary mailbox. And then you go up, and here's the stair, and the people go upstairs. And some of the things that I wanted to mention is because these accessory dwelling units are by definition small, what we try to do is think very critically and design very tightly that everything is really important, how we use space in very creative ways so that people could feel that they have spacious places, spacious kitchens, a lot of storage, and still fit into small places, right? So we had to have a stair in the middle of everything, and we created the very open see-through railing, and at the same time, no one's falling off the stair. And then under the stair, we have tucked in storage. And actually, this happens to be a whiteboard. So if you're sitting right here at your desk, you can turn around and draw on the whiteboard. So small things that are not adding a lot to the cost, but a very creative use of space is what adds to the charm of these small places. Here's another example of if you're making a stair and the stair is a little bit bigger, you could create a bench or you could build in shelves. Storage in these small places become very important. Or creating a relationship between the inside and the outside becomes really important. And here, this house is located in a very tight lot and they don't have a lot of backyard space, but having a side yard place for a table, it allows you to create rooms that make your home feel larger, but these rooms are outside. They're not internal. And I would like to leave you with this thought that the difference between theory and practice is a lot smaller in theory than it is in practice. And this is when I built my home many years ago. This is how I envisioned our playroom to look like, right? So that I would have this all neat, a few toys. And this is what it looks like in reality. So this is my son, and this is the construction that goes on in our house. And is it perfect? No. But as you work on these ordinances, these things are not perfect, but they develop and they make the best use of these tight spaces. So this space in our house is only 6 feet wide. And look at the amount of creativity one could fit in that. So think about the flexibility and the creativity that these spaces could bring and move forward with that.
Thank you, Marina. That was great. So I want to start with the Q&A, and I know how important personal experience can be, and I happen to know that both of you have ADUs. Can you speak about your own experience with an ADU and what you see as the benefits, the challenges, how just anything that you as homeowners have experienced with ADUs? Why don't we start with Marina and then we'll go to Janice.
Sure. So when my husband and I were building our own home, this is the first home that we've ever owned and built, I suggested that we include, at that point in Princeton, they were called flats. They were allowed, but they were not called accessory dwelling units. And, my husband wasn't sure, and he was saying, why would I live in a house with somebody else? This is so weird. Why don't we just have our own house? I said, let's just put it in. We'll deal with it later. So at first, he was extremely skeptical. And then, so I put in this accessory dwelling unit, and I thought either we were going to have an au pair possibly live there, either it's going to be for our parents to come live with us, or if I would like to work from home, I would like to have a home office. So those were the three options. So after we moved in, and as soon as we received our first tax bill, my husband's like, okay, rent it out now. It was immediate reaction. So for us, we've rented it out we've had various amazing people from throughout the world live with us, and they have helped. And first of all, when our kids were little, we had, as part of the payment, they had to babysit. So literally, we had people who were babysitting in exchange for rent. So that was a wonderful arrangement, and it helped us pay our taxes. And at the same time, they were babysitting for us. So that's my personal experience. And having been the guinea pig and tried it, I am ready to recommend it to other people.
Great, thank you. Janice.
Yeah, so I guess I'm a little bit unusual as an empty nester. When we sold, our big house in Montclair, we bought a smaller house, but on a property that included an accessory dwelling unit. And in terms of being an empty nester, having that accessory dwelling unit has been great because inevitably your children come back home. And over the past 4 years, each of my, and I have 3 adult children, they've all stayed there. some of them for, as long as 6 months. So it's been very helpful at this stage in our life to have it so that when our kids do come back as adults, there is a modicum of privacy and for both of us, and yet we are together. But in retrospect, it would have been very nice to have had that accessory unit when my kids were little, because we were 2 working parents and with 3 young children. We had nannies and au pairs, and particularly with the au pairs, they're living with you. And to have an accessory dwelling unit, which is a really small dwelling unit, but at least gives the caregiver privacy and the family a modicum of privacy, I think that would have been the perfect world. So I could really see the need, and particularly for you, Marina, I think that would have, I can really understand how that would be very helpful. So, yeah, I think we've been very, very happy with the options that the accessory dwelling unit gives us, even when we have extended family come visit, because we are spread out through the United States. There's someplace nice for them to stay. So it's worked out really well.
Great, thank you.
I want to follow up on a variation on the theme, Janice. What if the person who is the retiree wants to move into the ADU and rent the larger facility to someone else?
That should not be any problem whatsoever, because as long as it's, it's being managed by the homeowner, it doesn't matter if the homeowner is living in the larger unit or the smaller unit. It gives you the opportunity to live in the unit that meets your needs.
Perfect. Harold?
Okay, I have a question for you, Marina. So far, only 2 towns in New Jersey have an ADU ordinance, and a few others that I know of are considering it. Well, why do you think there's hesitancy to it?
That's a good question, and thank you for thinking of it. I think one is we covered it at the very beginning, that they're all called something different. So, for example, Montclair actually has an ADU ordinance, except it's called, what are they called? Carriage houses. They're just not thought of as accessory dwelling units. So as Zoe, who was on the previous panel, lives by the shore, there are plenty of other ordinances that they're just called something different. We haven't quite kind of mapped out where they are and what they're called. But also, as they become unified and clarified and become very similar, people start to think of them as this opportunity that it creates. So one potential fear that people have of these things is basically the fear of the unknown. How is this going to work? What happens? In one town, we had people ask, well, what if there are people who are going to move in there who I don't know? I just don't know these people. I know all my neighbors and I don't know these people. And it was very interesting because the council person at that council meeting, she said, oh, well, it's a really easy solution. You just walk up to them and you introduce yourself and now you know them. And we were like, oh, okay, well, that solves that problem. But it's mostly the fear of the unknown. And I think the more education, more clarification, and more understanding of that these things are everywhere. They're just not, we just don't even know what they're called, right? Like in Princeton, Princeton used to be 2 municipalities. There was the borough and the township, and they had 2 ordinances and they were called different things, even in the same town of Princeton. So once that gets clarified, I think everyone will just, in 10 years from now, we wouldn't even think this was ever a question.
So one of the things that's been coming up in the chat is some of these examples look like conversions to a duplex. Is there a standard difference between an attached ADU and conversion to a duplex? And does it depend upon local definitions, or is there some other criteria?
In my understanding, the accessory dwelling unit has to be smaller. So the Princeton's definition is that the accessory dwelling unit could be 800 square feet approximately, or 25% of the overall size of the home. So effectively, they could be thought of as a duplex, except one has to be, in my mind, when it's a duplex, they have to be the same size. And in these accessory dwelling unit configurations that we have, there's clearly one larger and one smaller.
Janice, anything to add?
No, I think the key difference is typically, as Marina said, the accessory dwelling unit is limited in size and it's much smaller than the primary unit.
There was one question that I'd like to interject now about really who drives the process. Now, this is something that a lot of homeowners who are interested in an ADU might be a little stymied by. Where do you go first? Do you go to the architect first? Do you go to the township first? I know, Marina, you showed us a wonderful thought process, but actually, if you want to get started, where do you start first?
I would start, and it's really interesting because it goes back to what Eli shared at the very beginning. And he said that a lot of the ADUs around the country are homeowner driven, and homeowners are sort of the do-it-yourselves. So I think in my mind, I would decide, am I going to do this by myself or am I going to hire a professional? If you're going to hire a professional, next step would be the architect. If you decided you're going to do it by yourself, that's totally possible, but then you're going to be building the team, taking on the risk, doing the research, figuring it out by yourself. That, I think that's the big distinction. And then if you're deciding to go the professional route, then I think architect is your starting point. Am I understanding that correctly, Janice?
I think I would suggest adding, as any homeowner should do, pull out your survey. Pull out your survey, pull out the zoning ordinance, call my office, call the planning office and the zoning officer, and talk about what are the options. And that's what I would suggest. Know your property first, know what the regulations are. And once you kind of have an idea of what your options, you may very well, the next step is usually to then hire the architect and have the architect, put the plans on paper. But yeah, we have a lot of people that do call our office to kind of find out what their options are.
Right, and it really depends on the municipalities, and some municipalities have incredible in-house resources like Janice, where you could just call up and they will help you. And other towns, like in San Francisco, forget it. They're not going to talk to you.
So that's two reasons to avoid San Francisco, what you just said, and earthquakes. So I'd like to, we're getting close to the end, and I want to follow up on something you just said, Janice, and I want to end it with a little bit of role playing. So Janice, why don't you play a town planner, like Montclair, for example, and Marina, why don't you play an architect with a client who wants to build an ADU in Montclair. So could you each ask each other what you want to know about Montclair for your client and what you want to know from the architect about their proposed project?
Okay, so let me start. An architect who calls me and says, I have a client who is interested in adding an accessory dwelling unit. My first comment would be, okay, do you have a survey of the property? How big is the yard? Is it something that they want to add on to their house? An addition on the first floor for potentially a barrier-free unit for an elderly parent or themselves? Or do they want something that's detached? And there's different requirements for the different kinds of accessory dwelling units. So I would start by that discussion by trying to find out which direction they want to go in, and then list the requirements that would have to be incorporated into the design.
Marina?
And I would I would go and have a preliminary discussion with my clients and understand what their goals are and what they're trying to achieve. And then I would encourage having design options. I'm a big fan of having very sketchy, very preliminary, boxes on paper without spending a lot of money and investing a lot of engineering. Just really, really sort of sketchy ideas. And then calling Janice and saying, Janice, we are working on this property and we have 2 or 3 options that meet our clients' needs. Would you mind meeting with us or taking a look, or can I send you an email and give me your sense what would be the best way to proceed here? If some of these are, don't even go there, that's really not going to work. And I would say I have done my own analysis and I understood what the zoning code requires, but you are the best expert in this. And tell me, did I miss anything? Does this work? Does this not work? And then hope that Janice would review and say, oh, okay, well, option 1 and 2 would work just fine, but option 3, bad idea that you forgot about this extra requirement. Does that seem logical, Janice?
That's how it usually works.
See, there you go. Right. And then you would say, because I think that saves people a lot of time rather than calling and saying, this is what I want to do. And then the planner says, well, you forgot about the this and the this and the this. That having options and remembering what the goals are really helps to save time and say, oh, okay, well, this could work with this modification, this could work with this modification. It saves a lot of that sort of looping around and wasting spinning wheels. Or I would definitely not recommend going around hiring engineers, getting everything designed, and then showing it to Janice. And then she's going to be like, oh boy, what about the X?
Right.
And any other questions you'd have for Marina?
Excuse me. No, actually.
No more questions.
Well, the real problem is that we're running out of time. I have to take a drink of water, excuse me. And on a Friday afternoon, we all want to get home before the big rain starts. So with that, we are really so happy you joined us today. We're full of ideas now, but you've demonstrated to us that it is doable. And it is even doable in Montclair under the current guidelines, even if they're not optimum, but it is doable. And we want to thank you very much for helping us see that. And now we're going to move to what I told you was going to be the icing on the cake, the resource library. How will you get to the information that we have gathered today and all the wisdom that was shared? As I mentioned, we have a resource library. It is on the Gateway portal. And I thought that Zoe made a very good point about this Gateway portal could become an access point to a lot of information about this topic. The Gateway portal is at the URL on your screen, https://schedulesplus.com/MTC-gateway/kiosk. If you've never been in this portal before, it's going to prompt you to put in your phone number. You put in your phone number and you'll go to what we have on the left side of the slide, and it will have a virtual center icon on the left column. You click on that icon, and the second half of this slide shows you all the assets that we've already pre-populated the portal with. We'll also be putting this recording up there, Laszlo's slides. Hopefully we'll get Marina's slides and anything else that will emerge over the next few months. We know that this is a big issue right now. It's being spoken about all over the United States and in New Jersey. And the fact that the Biden administration has actually made this gesture to support ADUs tells us this is not going away. It's only going to grow. So we recommend that you come to us for this resource library. And we have the expertise, thank goodness, of Harold Simon, who will help us curate the materials that are up there. So after this particular session is over, you will get a survey in your email. We're hoping you will be able to answer some of the questions in the survey. The information we collect will help us in planning where we go from here. And finally, something like this never happens unless there were a lot of people helping. On your screen, you'll now see some of the names of the people: technical staff, programming support, symposium organizing committee, lots and lots of people in the background making this possible. And thank you also to our sponsors and supporters who have helped make this process possible. And the support from the community has been very, very good. And this doesn't happen unless you've got a community behind you. So with that all, I'm going to say ciao for now and hope you enjoyed our symposium and now know what's in it for you, the ADU. Bye-bye.